Joe Rogan Podcast, check it out.
The Joe Rogan Experience.
Train by day, Joe Rogan Podcast by night, all day.
Randall Carlson, how are you, sir?
I'm doing well, Joe.
It's great to see you. It really is.
It's even greater to see you.
I was so looking forward to this podcast. I'm so excited about this subject. So whenever you're in town,
Well,
I'm
you know,
happy.
Joe, I drove 1,000 miles to get here. That's how much I'm.
That's a long drive. How long did that take?
We did 2 days. It's a 14-and-a-half-hour drive. But we got slowed down because of the weather.
Yeah, I was worried about that.
Yeah.
We've had some ice storms out here for people that don't know.
Yeah, right. We had.
So-
it was nasty for a while. But
And you're going to be out here. You're doing some exploring. You're doing some cave exploring as well.
well, we were going to go to see Hall's Cave, which is a
Pull that microphone up to you.
Hall's
They
Cave.
didn't get the
Like
arm.
this.
There you go.
How's
Yeah,
this?
Perfect.
Good. Yeah, Hall's Cave is near here, and this was a site that has extinct megafauna remains in it, and it also has some Clovis tools, and it has the Younger Dryas black mat stuff in it. So basically,
Black mat stuff, meaning whatever the impact was, what was
yes.
settled.
So right. So when you had the impact, or I think impacts plural, you had this dusting of stuff and a lot of fires. So the fires produce soot, charcoal. So at that layer, you have this black mat layer, and below it, you have megafauna, and above it, they're mostly gone. Below it, you have the Clovis culture. Above it, they're mostly gone. So Hall's Cave was a repository, and we were going to go in it. It belongs to an elderly couple that's on private property, but then when the COVID hit, they got worried about letting people in there, so it's been postponed. Thomas Stafford was the lead archaeologist on the job, on the project, and he had agreed to set it up for us, but then they got, like I said, the elderly couple that owns the cave, they got cold feet.
So is this because of the recent strains of COVID? Is this like...
No, this would have been...
So 2 years ago,
We were going to go, let's see, 2 years. Was it last summer? We were planning to go a year ago last summer. So it's been on hold, and I suspect that at some point we'll get to do it. But while I'm out here, we are going to check out a few things. Canyon Lake Gorge, which is down towards San Antonio, is a site that in 2002 there was a heavy, heavy rain, and Canyon Lake is a reservoir. It overflowed, and it cut this canyon and reproduced all these features like recessional cataracts and plunge pools and all these kind of things that geologists assumed were kind of slow to form, but are very similar to some of the things that are on a much grander scale that we'll look at here today. But what it is it's kind of almost forced a revision in thinking, because basically they're seeing this duplication of these forms, although on a smaller scale, but formed in 2 days and not thousands of years.
So for people that are not familiar with your work, I think we should probably give them a real quick refresher. When you're referring to the Younger Dryas, you're referring to the Younger Dryas impact theory. And this impact theory, you believe, probably ended the Ice Age, caused the extinction of many mammals and many species of life all over the earth.
All over the earth.
And reset civilization.
Pretty much, yeah. In a nutshell, that's kind of it.
And that is somewhere around 11,000, 12,000 years ago?
The dating of it, there's the Younger Dryas itself is about a 1,300-year interval. So to put this in perspective, go back 16 to 20,000 years ago, we're in the middle of the late glacial maximum, when more than double the amount of glacial ice on the planet now. We had North America, half of North America is buried under an ice sheet bigger than the one that now covers the South Pole. So all of Canada up to the Arctic Circle, northern United States, New York, Detroit, Philadelphia, Twin Cities, Seattle, all of that area was completely buried under this massive ice sheet. Around 15,000 years ago, 14,500 to 15,000 years ago, the climate began to warm. And this is probably because the changing geometries between the Earth and the Sun has this, it's called the Milankovitch cycles, and it basically is just the geometric relation between the Earth and the Sun, the orbit, the tilt of the Earth's axis, and so on, brings about gradual warming and gradual cooling. So what has been documented now is that the gradual warming began between 14,500 and 15,000 years ago. And so the great ice sheets began to shrink back, and they lost maybe 10 to 15% of their maximum mass. And this is when that ice-free corridor opened up between the two. You had two big ice sheets that were covering North America. Laurentide, centered on Hudson Bay, Cordilleran, centered over the Canadian Rockies. Around 16 to 18,000 years ago, they coalesced. They grew together. Then with that warming, they separated, and that's, you probably heard the term the ice-free corridor.
Yeah.
The old ideas that North America was exclusively populated by the Clovis people coming across the Bering Land Bridge, which was exposed because of lowered sea levels, migrating down through Alaska and through that ice-free corridor down into unglaciated North America, and then eventually all the way down to Tierra del Fuego within 1,000 years. So now you've got this gradual warming. Now at about 12,850 to 12,900 years ago, that process is suddenly interrupted by this massive spasm of cold, right, that basically undoes 2,500 years of warming, just undoes it. And now the planet is plunged back into full glacial cold, and it takes like 1,300 years for the planet to resume its upward arc of warming. So at the beginning of that is when the spike of mass extinctions took place, and that's also when the COVID culture in North America that had been very prolific.
You mean Clovis?
Clovis. What
You
did I
said
say?
COVID. We all have COVID on the brain.
God, I know.
No worries.
The Clovis culture, yeah. The Clovis culture, they disappeared.
Maybe I heard he did say COVID, right?
It might have been Clovid. I don't know.
Clovis?
I think
Thoroughly confused.
Either way.
Well,
It's okay. Maybe I'm hearing it.
yeah, well, it could be. Or I should take a little break here and take my afternoon nap, but my after lunch nap. That's part of my religion now is I take an afternoon nap every day.
It's good religion.
It's a pretty good religion.
That's
yeah.
solid.
Yeah, that's my ritual nap every day. So anyways, not to get off on that,
Okay.
but so it lasts about 1,300 years. At about 11,600 years ago, it ended. Now, what's interesting about this, about the Younger Dryas period, is that it's almost bookmarked with two catastrophes. The catastrophe at 11,600 years ago is still kind of undefined. There's been no, to my knowledge, evidence of any kind of extraterrestrial impact. However, there was a massive pulse of melting that occurred. And so it's referred to as meltwater pulse 1B. Now, there was a meltwater pulse 1A that is now dated at 14,600. And there's evidence now emerging that there was also a major melting event at the beginning of the Younger Dryas. But it was so quick before the planet jumped back into full glacial cold that it's kind of been overlooked. So anyways, what's interesting about meltwater pulse 1B, that's 11,600 years ago. Now, that is now given as the definition between the Pleistocene, which was two and a half million years, which was differentiated from the previous Pliocene, because in the Pleistocene epoch, what characterizes this epoch is the planet started lurching back and forth between the glacial and interglacial ages, right? So at the end of the Pleistocene, we get into the Holocene. Holocene is now, the onset of the Holocene is dated 11,600 years ago. And shortly within a millennia to 2 millennia after that is when we begin to see the rise of what eventually led to modern civilization. We see the domestication of animals. We see the major shift in lifestyles from mostly, if not all, hunter-gatherers now into a agricultural-based lifestyle. So we see really the rise of agriculture in those 2 millennia after the beginning of the Holocene. What else? Oh, the dispersion of languages generally traces back to around roughly 10,000 years ago. What else? The rise of urban areas. The first Çatalhöyük and Jericho and other cities like that are showing up between 8,000 and 9,000 years ago. So basically all the accoutrements of civilization that eventually led to, what we think of as modern history, 4,500 to 5,000 years ago, all sort of got launched in this Younger Dryas epoch, if you will. So the question is what caused these tremendous sea level rise? And I think in one of our previous interviews, I actually pulled up a graph where you could see that these two great spikes of meltwater. Rather than it being tens of thousands of years in a smooth curve, it was two major spikes of meltwater. So in order to trigger that melting, you had to have some kind of input of energy. It takes energy to melt ice. So one of the mysteries that actually began to be noticed in the early 70s was what is called the energy paradox. Now, with the advent of radiocarbon dating in the 1950s, what happened is you accumulated a couple of decades of radiocarbon dating. After a couple of decades, the geologists and the climatologists and so on, they're looking at that data and they're going, wait a second, our old models of glacial, the onset of a glacial period, the termination of a glacial period, were tens of thousands of years, 50, 60, 70,000 years. Radiocarbon dating is now showing it happened way, way faster than that. For example, radiocarbon dating showed that in central area of Canada, where it was assumed that there had been a mile and a half of ice, forests were growing, like 30,000, 35,000 years ago. Well, clearly there was no ice there when the forests are growing there, right? The other thing was the rapidity with which the whole thing came to an end. Rather than 15, 20, 25,000 years, it was more like 3, 4, 5,000 years. So this is what introduced the concept of the energy paradox. Like, where the hell did all the energy come from to melt that much ice? And so there was a group of scientists that held a conference in 1973, didn't resolve it, held another conference in 1975, still didn't resolve it. What they were looking at, they go, okay, well, what is the greatest concentration of available thermal energy on the planet today to melt ice? So they said, well, it looks like it's equatorial regions over equatorial oceans. Okay, so if we applied that much thermal energy to these ice sheets, how long would it take to melt? 20 to 25,000 years to completely melt away. So that was the energy paradox. And it really has not been resolved to this day. And see, the assumption was that the energy would have applied in a uniform manner from the beginning of the start of the deglaciation to the end of the deglaciation. But it didn't happen that way. It happened in pulses. So in other words, even though you have a tremendously enlarged amount of energy to melt this ice, basically, it didn't happen smoothly. It was concentrated into several episodes, which means then that you have even more thermal energy to try to explain. So it kind of got left there. And, of course, then I encountered that. I mean, I guess, going way back in the late 70s, early 80s, when I first got obsessed with the catastrophic history of this planet and geology and all of that, that's when I read these papers. And I kind of thought, well, what's the possibility? It's got to be impacts or it's got to be the sun. What else could it be? There's no intrinsic source of that much heat to melt the ice that quick. So I was very gratified when in 2007 the paper came out proposing that there had been an impact at the Younger Dryas, triggering the Younger Dryas. And we talked about that with Graham on here. Yeah. And that's actually what inspired Graham to come back to his original idea that he had proposed in Fingerprints of the Gods back in 95 or 96, was the two things, the discovery of Göbekli Tepe, which, is back 11,500 years old, right? And the evidence that there had been this cometary impact. So in his Fingerprints of the Gods, he was still thinking, had documented tremendous amount of evidence for catastrophe. But what he wasn't thinking, he was thinking more in terms of the scenario or the models of Charles Hapgood, who was thinking in terms of pole shift. Well, that idea kind of fell by the wayside because it wasn't making sense from the geophysical standpoint and a lot of reasons. But then when 2007 came along and this paper came out, Graham was pretty much electrified when he saw that and said, well, there's the catastrophe. It was an impact, and why didn't I think of that? He probably did, but so that's what caused him to circle back.
When did they first start discovering nuclear glass? The tritonite, is that how you say it?
Trinitite.
Trinitite. When did they first started
well, the first discovery of that, it comes from Trinity, New Mexico.
Yeah.
So
But I mean,
summer of July of 1945.
What I mean in core samples, when they were examining.
When would that have been?
Because that's one of the pieces of evidence that they point to, correct?
Yes. So I think maybe, the Tunguska event of 1908, I think maybe in 60s or 70s they may have found glass associated with that. Certainly by the 50s and 60s, they were finding glass associated with impact craters.
And when they do core samples, they do find an associated supply of this stuff.
Yeah, yes. There's a variety of proxies that will indicate impacts. The melt glass is one of them, right? And
so that's trinitite.
Yes. You'll have microspherules, which form when you have a hypervelocity impact. You've got to think an object coming in closing velocity at 10 to 20 times the muzzle velocity of a high-powered rifle. It's coming in, it slams into the earth. It has a whole suite of consequences, one of which a lot of the material that's directly in the epicenter gets vaporized. That vapor goes up into the stratosphere. It begins to circulate. As it cools, it drops back to Earth, and it will form both microspherules and microtectites. And microtectites are small, little aerodynamically shaped forms they're called microtectites because you really only see them under a microscope. And likewise with the microspherules. Then you have nanodiamonds. Nanodiamonds are only produced under extraordinary regimes of heat and pressure. So you've got microspherules, you've got the trinitite and the melt glass, you've got the microspherules, you've got iridium, other platinum group metals. Now associated with the Younger Dryas, they've found iridium spikes, osmium spikes, and platinum spikes, which are all part of the platinum group metals, all of which are pretty much abundant in cosmic things like asteroids, right? So you had the finding of that. I think in the Greenland ice cores, platinum showed up in iridium. See what else? Charcoal, soot, if there's fires. So soot has been found in conjunction with that black matte layer. That's one of the reasons it's black, is because of the amount of charcoal and soot in it.
Meaning there was some sort of massive fires that were associated with the impact.
Yes, that's right. So, the critics came out, savaged it. The first group, I think, was 17 scientists that signed off on that paper, 2007. Actually, and they formed a group called the Comet Research Team, organized by George Howard, who runs the Cosmic Tusk website. He'd be a great guest, by the way. He's really he knows more about the Younger Dryas than I do. He has a good comprehension of it, and so he does the Cosmic Tusk website, and he helped to organize this Comet Research Team. Now, the Comet Research Team has grown to over 50 members since 2007, and I have been out in the field with a couple of times with some members of the group. Chris Moore, for example, who originally was one of the skeptics. So we were out. We can circle back to this too. The Carolina Bays, which are these unique elliptical features on the southeastern coastal plain of the United States. So we were out in the field. It was me and him, George Howard. Graham Hancock was with us on that one, and Malcolm LeCompte. I don't know if you remember Malcolm. He was the scientist that Graham brought in on our side during the great debate. Right?
During the phone call, right?
During the phone call. Yeah. That was Malcolm LeCompte. He was there. So Chris Moore, I had a chance to have extensive conversations with him, and he basically said, well, yeah, I originally came on as a skeptic. I was going to debunk this, and then I began seeing the evidence, and now I'm a believer. So,
well, it ties neatly together, right? It really does. It seems like that it's the thing that makes the most sense when you look at all the physical evidence, when you look at how quickly things changed. I did not know that that the amount of melting would have taken that long, though. That's pretty extraordinary.
Well, you see, you got to bear in mind, too, that what will happen under normal circumstances is you will have a melting season, summer, right? Fall comes, things get cold again, melting stops, and then you have more ice accumulation because it's now snowing during the winter. So really, if you say 20,000 years or 15,000 years to melt, you've got to actually cut that in half or less because you're only going to have really, especially in the northern latitudes, you're going to only have probably 3 or 4 months out of each year where actually the ice diminishes in mass. So that's one reason why it'll stretch. It's not like a continuous process. But yeah, I think I've got, let's see, if I've got it right here, I'll pull this up. But yeah, so that was the thing when I discovered that in the late 70s is when I started thinking, okay, so something unusual happened that we don't really have an explanation for.
Didn't you come up with the idea while you were on acid?
Well, what a great well, I would say that was a factor. Yes, I would. Okay.
Nothing wrong with great ideas on acid, ladies and gentlemen. Kerry Mullis, didn't he come up with partially the idea for the PCR test?
I think that's right. I think I couldn't
Is it
swear
the
to it.
PCR test or some great discovery?
So this is, this was the energy paradox research here. This was one of the guys who was the John T. Andrews. You can see 1973, the Wisconsin Laurentide ice sheet. The Laurentide was the big one, right? Dispersal centers, and this is the key, problems of rates of retreat. So this was when they began to say, hey, there's a problem here, guys. You know? So let's see here. And this was one of the bizarre things. See, if you go, the average marginal recession, that's the ice, shrinking back, between 12,000 and 7,000 years before present. BP is before present.
Is that a new phrase, before present?
I've seen it in the literature going back 20 or 30 years. Geologists use that, whereas historians and archaeologists tend to use BC.
Right.
Right. But if you're talking about something that happened 50 or 500,000 years ago, saying BC doesn't make sense.
Right, it seems silly. You have to do extra math.
Right.
Right.
So this is the first thing they noticed, that the rate of recession, you would assume that it's going to be faster at the southern margin, right, and much slower, because the northern margin is up by the Arctic Circle, right? What they saw, that it varied little between the northwest and southern margins. So that was the first mystery. So then the second thing was, of primary concern is the energy balance at the margin of the ice sheet required to promote the rapid late Wisconsin retreat. The growth and development of the Laurentide ice sheet complex is still an enigma. That was in 73. It's still an enigma in 2002, which is why I find it so interesting, is because there are mysteries out there, and I love a good mystery. Unexplained is the growth of the ice cap in its gathering grounds of Baffin Island. So they're saying we don't even know how it started.
When you said 2002, did you mean 2022? Or do you mean 2002?
No, I meant 2022.
Okay.
Thank you, Joe, for keeping me on track.
Listen, you have so much information in your head, some of it's going to spill out the sides.
Yeah, some of it does spill out the side. So here was the question. The average annual rate of marginal retreat of the Laurentide ice sheet calculated from the reduction area was 260 meters per year, which is 853 feet. So that means over the whole period of disappearance of the ice, it's on average 853 feet. Every year, the ice is receding, right? And this high figure immediately raises the question of what energy sources are available to cause such a rapid retreat. A significant aspect of the Laurentide deglacial history is the high energy inputs required, which, that was what came up in the 1970s. They still haven't, the high energy inputs. Let's see. So this is kind of showing here, like imagine that this is the marginal profile of the ice sheet. And then as it recedes, it's also wasting vertically as well because it's retreating, but it's also shrinking this way. So what it comes down to, rates of ice retreat in meters per year for the northwest, southwest, south, and northeast sectors of the Laurentide ice sheet. And what they discovered was the rate of retreat up on the northern section was just as fast as the southern. So what the hell is going on here?
It's happening simultaneously.
It's happening simultaneously, yeah.
Is there a competing theory?
I've never seen it.
You've never seen any competing theory on the rapid recession of the ice caps?
I have not. I have not. Other than I've seen several attempts to try to explain it through gradualistic processes, but I think that it's been one of those things that it's so bizarre that almost like, let's just stay away from that for the time being.
It's interesting that there's resistance to it because we know that there are asteroidal impacts and comet impacts. We know all that stuff's real. We know we're in the middle of space and it happens all the time. We could just look at the moon with its lack of atmosphere and we know there's craters all over it. So we know things get hit constantly and we're dealing with this immense period of time. It just seems logical.
It seems logical.
Yeah.
And, you know, Fred Hoyle and Chandra Wickramasinghe, they theorized way back, I think, in the 70s that there was an extraterrestrial cause to ice ages, that the planet might get dusted with extraterrestrial, including nanodiamonds that are so small and very reflective of heat, that may be, was not accepted back in the 70s just because it's pretty much outside. See, they were still looking for what the Milankovitch, this is what I was mentioning earlier, the changing geometry of the Earth and the Sun. The problem with that, though, is the rates. You know, those are slow, long, very gradualistic. What we're seeing now is stuff is like happening like that.
How quick are we talking about when you're talking about this recession of the ice caps from the time where there's a mile-high sheet of ice to what we see?
5,000 years.
5,000 years.
But within there, see, you can say 5,000 years and you might think of a uniform process. It's diminishing in mass uniformly each year, but that's not what happened. Because even during the Younger Dryas, now the evidence suggests that more or less gradualistic shrinking was interrupted, and then you had a regrowth of the ice sheet. So the process was interrupted, see? So what that leads is, again, we don't really have gradualistic explanations for it. That's why I think we have to go to a more catastrophic scenario.
And this catastrophic scenario, we're not talking about one individual event. We're talking about possibly multiple impacts.
That's what I would definitely lean towards.
And this is over a course of how many years?
Well, I think that if we look at the work of, and I've mentioned this on your show before, the work of, in fact, in one of our conversations we had, it was William Napier, who's a British astronomer, commented that he was pleased that we had talked about it. And I mentioned that Victor Klube and William Napier and several of these others that were sort of called them neo-catastrophists, if you will. And they really began proposing in the late 70s and early 80s things like ice age, you know, impacts may be responsible for a lot of things. They may be responsible for increased amounts of volcanic eruptions because, you know, hypervelocity impact can be very damaging. You know, the analogy that I like to use, if you have like a .38 caliber bullet, right, and I was to throw that at you, even as hard as I could, and it hit you, might sting a little bit. It's not going to do any damage at all. But that same .38 caliber, accelerated to, you know, 2,500 feet per second, a lot of damage. Now, you take a half-mile space rock, accelerate it by a factor of 10 beyond that, and slam it into the Earth, yeah, it's going to have consequences that could take, you know, thousands of years, actually, to play out.
Is there an estimate of how many impacts there were?
Not yet.
Not yet?
I think there was probably in the range of about 10 impacts.
So 10 over the course of a few thousand years?
Yes, although they were probably concentrated. I think that you had a concentrated series of impacts right around the beginning of the Younger Dryas, because that's where the proxies are found. We still don't have an explanation for the end of the Younger Dryas. Something interesting, though, it's one of these coincidences that I should bring up. We talked a little bit at one point, maybe the first meeting we had, we talked about Plato and the story of Atlantis. And I noticed some of the negative comments were like, oh, I heard him mention Atlantis, so I just immediately turned it off because that's BS, you know. Well, whether Atlantis really existed or not, that's a whole nother interesting question. And as a matter of fact, I just a few weeks ago did a part 1 of a 6-part series, a live stream, where I'm like line by line dissecting what Plato actually said, going through 4 or 5 different translations, going back to some of the original Greek language that he used. But the thing that really initially, I wasn't that interested in the Atlantis thing until I realized that if you go into his dialogue, Timaeus, just before he begins the story of Atlantis, he prefaces it with by referencing the myth of Phaeton. And Phaeton being the son of Helios, who tried to drive his father's chariot in the path of the sun and completely failed. And the chariot deviated off the path of the sun, and it declined or deviated down to the earth, and it set the world on fire. Now, in the story of Atlantis, Solon is hearing this story from these elderly Egyptian priests who say that they have preserved that story in their sacred registers for 9,000 years. Is that possible? I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. But this is what was related, that it was preserved in their sacred registers and in their temples for 9,000 years. And this was prior to Solon's 10-year sojourn in Egypt, right? Solon's sojourn in Egypt happens at 600 BC. Let me think of that. Let me think of this. Yes. So basically, if you add that to the 9,000, you go back from now to 600 BC, that's 2,600 years.
Yeah.
Add that to 9,000, what do you get? 11,600.
You get around the time of the Younger Dryas impact.
The end of the Younger Dryas, meltwater pulse 1b. So you have a rapid rise, what John Shaw, Canadian geologist, the late John Shaw, called a CRE, which is catastrophic rise event. So there was a catastrophic rise event at 11,600 years ago. Plato gives that date based on the chronology from Solon down through Drapidas, through Critias the Elder, through Critias the Younger, then finally to Socrates and Plato. Coincidence? Perhaps that's what the skeptic would say. It's just a coincidence. I'm not quite so ready to dismiss things like that as coincidence, because it's pretty amazing that he puts the demise of Atlantis, that it subsides beneath the ocean as a result of an earthquake and a rapid rise of sea level, and there's meltwater pulse 1b right there. Who knows? But what to me even makes it more interesting is because he prefaces the whole story with this Phaeton myth. And then he says, let's see, I bet you I have it right here. Let's see. There we go. Let's see if we can open this up and you can see exactly what Plato says. And let's see here if we zoom down to...
Have you seen that geological formation in, I believe it's Africa? The
recap structure. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
What are your thoughts on that?
That it's natural.
You think it's natural?
I think it's natural. I think it's very interesting. I first discovered that maybe 20 years ago because it was when it was first discovered because of NASA photography. They were looking at it and thinking this might be a multi-ringed impact structure. So I thought, oh, add this to the ever-growing list of impact structures. However, subsequent research showed that it was pretty much natural. And I think, yeah, here we go right here. So this is, since you brought it up and asked about it, you can see here there's a magma body beneath the structure. It's volcanic. And let's see. An external basaltic ring dike is displaced by a north-northeast, south-southwest fault system in the northeastern part of the structure and is cross-cut by carbonatite dikes. So you can see there's this whole magma chamber beneath the thing.
I see. And how do they find that?
Oh, geophysical surveys.
And so what that would indicate was that this is probably the remnants of a volcanic eruption, like some sort of a caldera, like the same way that we have Yellowstone when they found that from space?
It was probably pressure from below causing an updoming, right? Now, you've got multiple layers like this. Now you picture you've got a circular updoming. Now you truncate that. If you can picture that you've got these multiple stratigraphic layers, right? It forces it into a circular, sort of a dome-shaped uplift, and then you truncate it, you slice the top of that off. What you're going to have is multiple rings that are now exposed.
Okay.
So
it makes sense if it's in that area where this volcanic activity takes place, and that this is a natural possibility.
Yeah. Now, I know that Jimmy has looked at that. Yeah. And I don't know Jimmy personally. I like the guy without knowing him. You interviewed him, right?
Yeah, very nice guy.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Yeah. I'd like to get him out in the field with me and show him some stuff firsthand. I bet
he would love that.
I think
he's
he would.
a giant fan of your work.
I like to hear that. Well, I'm a fan of his work, but I don't happen to agree on this one.
Well, I mean, I don't even know if he agrees. I think he's just speculating.
Yeah.
He's not dogmatic. Like, he doesn't have like a rigid perspective on this.
Yeah, here you can see. There's the recat structure. What is interesting, though, is look at this. You've got this structure up here, the terminate tenomere. I forget how you pronounce that. I knew how to pronounce it. But anyways, that's an impact crater there. There's one here. We can actually, if we go back, the Tenumer crater in Mauritania, that's impact. And the Temimichat.
That's it.
So what's interesting, though, check this out. There's one, there's two, and here's the recat structure. They fall in a perfect alignment. Now, what's the explanation there? I don't know.
Could just be coincidence, right?
Could be coincidence, yeah. Could be coincidence.
One of the things that he said about the recut structure was that around it, the white appears to be salt.
Which could be. And I mean, see, the rim rock of this is late Cretaceous, about 90 million years old. So at that point, it was below the ocean, right? So it's been uplifted. I think this thing is about 1,400 or 1,500 feet above sea level, if memory serves me correct. So it's been eroded. You see, this whole thing here is like an erosion. You had a massive amount of water that came down over this, and most likely is what exposed this thing to the surface. It was probably buried. Let's see here. So right there is, from Plato, that's the ringed city of Atlantis to scale.
The concentric rings.
The concentric ring. So this is the actual scale superimposed onto the recat structure.
So it's much smaller in scale.
Yeah.
But Plato's scale was based on what?
The stade. It was based on the stade, which is roughly 607 feet. It's where we get the word stadium from.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, because that was the length of a stadium in ancient Greece.
So when you look at Plato's version of this, sorry to take you on this detour, but I was just curious. When you look at Plato's version of Atlantis, is there an area of the world that seems likely? Yeah?
Yeah. Yeah. You better watch my 6-hour presentation,
Okay,
Joe.
I will.
Yeah, no, but I look, it's detailed. That's why even in 6 hours, I can't really spell it. In the podcast I did, the first 9 episodes, 2 hours each, were devoted to, I thought, well, let's kick it off with Atlantis.
18 hours of Atlantis.
18 hours of it. The last episode 9 was devoted to the recat structure.
Wow.
So I had eight hours, so 16 hours, but we had some chatter and things like that in there, so maybe more like 12 or 14 hours. So you know who Johanna James is?
No.
She is a British actress who started doing this She's a really cool lady. She's very interested in all this kind of stuff. Very smart, extraordinarily beautiful. And she went on and did she does these like 20-minute, 30-minute little vignettes of things that she's really interested in, having to do a lot with, ancient cultures, all the kind of things that, Graham Hancock is, she reads Graham Hancock. She became a fan of mine, and she devoted one of her little 20 or 30-minute segments to, she said, I watched all 10 hours or 12 hours of Randall Carlson's programs on Atlantis. And so she did this like 30-minute little synopsis of it. Really did a great job. So we reached out to her. I invited her on. She came on. We did a live stream a couple of weeks ago with her as a guest. And just really fun lady. She's also does comedy.
Really?
Yeah. And she's very intelligent, very gorgeous, what can I say? And smart and interested in all this kind of stuff. So, there we go. Anyways, so she was very interested in the whole Atlantis thing. And so because of that, there was a lot of feedback and people wanting to know more. And so I thought, okay, now the 10 or 12 hours I did, what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to condense that down. So a couple of weeks ago, we did the first 3-hour live stream where I basically started breaking down Plato's account line by line. What did he actually say? Let's look at the geology. Let's look at the geography, the oceanography, the astronomy, and see if it lines up, if it matches up. And so I think there's one place that pretty much is not all the details, but when you look at all of the areas around the planet that have been proposed for Atlantis, I think there's one place that fits the majority of his details, and that's the sunken Azores Plateau. And I say sunken because we know it's sunken, and it's right along the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. In fact, since we're on this subject, and I wasn't even thinking we'd get on this subject, there's the Azores Plateau right there. It straddles a triple plate junction, which you have the European plate, the African plate, and the North American plate here.
Well, it's up near Nova Scotia?
Yeah, it's far north. It is. But notice over here, it's really almost at the same latitude as Spain. See? And I would say that if there's any place on the planet that is most consistent with Plato's account, that's it right there.
Why is that? Without doing an 18-hour presentation.
Oh, come on, Joe. Can't we have pizza brought in?
We can.
Nah, that's why, in a nutshell, God, where do I even begin? So, I was afraid you were going to ask that, but we can look very quickly, I guess, like give you the 5-minute version, which is that there is evidence that there was a massive subsidence along the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. We actually talked about this a little bit, and I think in our very first discussion we had, which was what, 7, 8 years ago?
At least.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we talked about this a little bit. Geophysics shows that there's horizontal movement, lateral movement of the Earth's crust because of continental drift, but there's also vertical movement. And that is the result of isostatic compensation. That's called isostasy is the vertical movement of the Earth's crust. I can show you, I should have a slide right here that will help to really illustrate what it is. Let me back up to, let's see. Should be right in here. Here we go. Okay, so now this is the shore of Hudson Bay. Now this is where the ice sheet was the thickest, right? Now what are you seeing there? Hudson Bay is up here. These are shorelines because when the ice was removed, the land started rising back. So here's sea level, land is rising back.
And the land is rising because of a lack of weight of the ice?
Yes, right. So you're sitting on a soft, cushiony chair right now, right? Are you?
Yep.
Okay, so your ass is causing isostatic depression of that cushion on your chair.
Right. When I lift
and if you sit up,
yeah,
you'll have isostatic compensation. Right?
So that's what that is along many, many, many lines.
Yes, those are all shorelines. Wow. Here's another view of it.
Wow.
Here's another view.
Wow.
That's the land rebounding a couple of thousand feet after the ice was removed. Now, the ice was removed, and all of those trillions of tons of weight, where did it go? In the Atlantic Ocean. Now, you look, the thinnest crust on the Earth is the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. And if you look at it, you'll see that there are transform faults, which should show up right here. The transform faults are these vertical fault lines that are what you would say orthogonal or at right angles to the ridge itself. Here you can see very clearly the triple plate junction and how the Azores Plateau. Okay, well, since the 1940s, the first expedition in 1948, there was when they started doing dredge samples from the floor of the Atlantic Ocean, which coincidentally, the name of the ship was the Atlantis. They dredge core samples, and they pull up the core samples from 2 miles down, a mile to 2 miles down, and they look at those core samples. And what you had was, for example, shallow water creatures living. They weren't living. They were now, they had been drowned. You had creatures like that typically lived under 100 feet of seawater. And now they're a mile and a half below. And they're on the flanks of this place right here.
So these are fossils that they're finding?
Yes.
And they're finding fossils that ordinarily you would find in some place that was very shallow.
Very shallow. Very shallow, yes.
Or relatively shallow, 100 feet.
100 feet, yes. So this is the basic idea here. This goes back to the 60s. As it says right here, the possible tectonic implications of glacioeustatic. Now, eustatic is the rise and fall of sea level correlated with the increase and decrease of glacial ice. So if the ice is increasing, sea level is falling, and we call that eustatic sea level fall. If the ice is shrinking, melting, sea level's rising. So that's a eustatic rise. So that's the meaning of that. When you see glacioeustatic, that means the rise and fall of the sea level as a result of glacier growth or melting. Okay? And it says here, sea level fluctuations have received only minor attention in connection with such problems as ocean floor spreading. The purpose of this report is to point out that late Pleistocene sea level data suggests that the ocean basins have responded isostatically and by a significant amount, particularly concentrated along the mid-Atlantic ridge. I've got so much here. I'm just going to grab a couple of these things here. Yeah. So they dug up these cobbles, which are, the cobbles are, so a cobble is basically a stone or anything that's lithified that's roughly between a pebble and a boulder. A boulder, when you get, I think, to 11 inches, about the size of a volleyball, now you're in the realm of boulders. A cobble is in between pebbles and boulders, like you've heard of cobblestone streets, they're fist-sized rocks, basically. So they say here, the Atlantis cruiser and Great Meteor seamounts rise from a broad ridge or plateau, which extends from the mid-Atlantic ridge, blah, blah, blah. Let's see. So about a ton of flat pteropod limestone cobbles was dredged from the summit area of one of these sunken, what they're calling the seamounts. And a seamount is like a flat-topped mountain, right? Like the top of the mountain has been sheared off, okay? So they pulled up these limestones, right? These limestone cobbles. They dated them. One of the cobbles gave an apparent radiocarbon age of 12,000 years, plus or minus 900 years. The state of lithification, how much it is turned into rock, of the limestone suggests that it may have been lithified under subaerial conditions. In other words, in the atmosphere. That's what that means. It may have been lithified under subaerial conditions, and the seamount may have been an island within the past 12,000 years.
Wow.
So, we could go through, again, hours of this kind of research. And why it's been pushed off to the side is anybody's guess. But it just doesn't fit the paradigm. But, yeah, basically, now this doesn't prove that there was any civilization there, but we can make a very strong case that a large section of the Azores Plateau was above sea level during the late glacial maximum.
Does it coincide with Plato's account of trade and of travel and of the way?
Well, we have no way of knowing. See, now there we have to make a leap of faith, which is this. If we look right here, you'll see... you can see it very clearly, and you can see the Straits of Gibraltar here, which was anciently known as the Pillars of Heracles. And you come here to a group of islands, and then you get to the Azores Plateau. And here, these down here are those seamounts, those truncated seamounts. So really, all you have to do, here's the leap of faith you have to make. You have to go, now I don't get into anything like, whatever, flying spaceships or crystal ray guns or anything like that. No, I just go by what Plato says. What he's describing is a maritime culture that had navigational abilities. Something along the lines of the Minoan or the Phoenician culture, maybe by an order of magnitude, right? So now all we have to do really is assume this which to me is not so pseudoscientific that we couldn't even consider it, which is that some group in the Ice Age had enough navigational skills to sail from Europe to islands right here.
And what would be the reason why they would go there? Like, what was so exceptional, supposedly, about Atlantis?
Well, I'll show you one
a
thing.
Hub of trade. It was supposed to be a very advanced city, right?
Well, advanced in the standpoint that yes, it was engaged in trade. It had a broad net of cultural connections around the world. But if you look at this is, if you go right here, let's see, the position of the Gulf Stream during Quaternary glaciations. In the present-day North Atlantic Ocean, the boundary between the subtropical and subpolar gyres runs southwest to northeast from Hatteras to the Northern Sea. So we'll get down here, right? See, in contrast, during the last glacial maximum, approximately 18,000 years ago, the gyre boundary and associated currents were more zonal and located further to the south. So here's a map showing basically what you would have had. So this is the Gulf Stream. So it's bringing up the warm equatorial waters and wrapping it right around the Azores. So if you were going to try to theorize or hypothesize an ideal climate during the Ice Age, there it is right there. You see, that Gulf Stream, it's the Gulf Stream now. That's why you have, warmth basically in the UK, right?
And is there any physical evidence other than the cobblestones or anything? Yeah?
Plant remains.
Plant remains.
Dredged up plant remains, yes. Yeah. Plant remains that would have been growing, in a climate, not consistent with the Ice Age.
What about anything that would indicate human settlement?
No, not yet. Although I've heard some things, I haven't seen confirmation. I think it's going to take submersible.
Yeah.
We're just at the very beginnings of submarine archaeology.
And how deep is this area again?
Well, you see, right now it is the Azores are actually islands that are above sea level. And the major part of the plateau is a mile to mile and a half underwater.
So that's where all the action would be?
Most likely, yes. Yes.
And is there any sort of plan to do an excavation or some sort of an expedition where they go underwater and look at some of that stuff and try to find some physical evidence?
Not yet, but I was thinking, Joe, that you and I could see what.
Okay.
You ready to take a ride?
Well, do you know James Cameron? Maybe we could borrow his submarine.
Well, I don't want to say this, but I've actually had somebody contact me who's 2 steps removed. I won't get into that because I don't like to count chickens. You know what I'm saying?
I get it.
Yeah.
James Cameron, if you're out there, I'm with you, brother.
Yeah. Yeah. When we're not,
let's go find it.
When we're not recording.
That guy's a wild man.
I know.
Literally, I mean, he's one of the most successful movie producers in the history of the human race, right?
Yeah.
But yet he's so crazy, he gets in a submarine and goes to the bottom of the fucking ocean.
Right. See, and here's the thing. You got to, and a lot of what I'm documenting here is how catastrophic some of these events were.
Yeah.
I mean, you would have had massive tsunamis that would have affected everything, And like Plato says, Atlantis subsided beneath the waves because of a great earthquake. And we can actually show now that that there has evidence of massive traumatic seismic events along the mid-Atlantic ridge coincident with the rapid rise of sea level. So a lot of the pieces fit together. Doesn't prove anything, but to me it makes the case that it might be worth it to go down and have a closer look.
All they would need is some pottery, right? All they would need is something.
My guess is that whether it's to be taken literally or not, Plato's description of the infrastructure, I would think that the infrastructure, the multi-ringed, if that was real and not just metaphorical, that's kind of what you would look for.
Some of it.
Yeah. In other words, I mean, we do know that these ancient peoples, just from historical times, were, and this is what Graham documents from all over the world. These people had extraordinary engineering skill.
Yeah.
The ability to, organize on a huge scale, quarry 50, 100, 200-ton and larger stones, move them around with impunity all over the world. And that, to me, has always struck me as a builder. I've had a little bit of experience moving beams and things that weigh half a ton to a ton, and I know what's involved. If you don't have a crane, you got to do it manually. So I'm doing that, and I'm often thinking, wait a second, what if I'm going to do 2.3 million stones that weigh this much?
Right, like the temple, like Giza. The
yeah,
pyramid.
I mean, that's a hell of a lot of work and social organization that's required.
And math.
Yeah, and hey, does it make sense that you've got these kinds of undertakings, by people that were just a generation or two before subsistence farmers or hunter-gatherers? I just have a hard time with that.
It's definitely interesting.
Yeah.
It's also interesting how some parts of the world were so sophisticated in relationship to other parts of the world, whereas some parts of Europe weren't that sophisticated at all.
Right.
Egypt was thriving in making construction on a scale that that boggles the mind today.
And we've seen even in recent times, high advanced technological cultures living side by side with basically Stone Age cultures.
Yes.
And if this planet was be subjected to some of the kinds of events like the Younger Dryas event, there would be really no trace in 10,000 years of our presence here, other than the Stone Age material.
Right. Like all of our hard drives, all of our phones, all be deteriorated and
all
disappear.
plastic is gone.
Gone. Everything's gone.
Cars, gone.
I was trying to have a conversation with my kids about this. We were talking about books and how even books are going away and books are becoming hard drives.
Yeah.
And I'm saying, do you know, like if something happened, everything we know would be gone so quickly.
Yeah.
It's a real problem because it's so convenient to my phone has a terabyte of data on it, which is astounding.
I know.
It's astounding that you could have that much data on your phone, but if that phone dies, all that stuff's gone.
All that stuff is gone.
If we got hit, if something hit us, if we lost the power grid for a decade, if we got down to, like we were talking before this podcast about the Toba volcano in Indonesia, and about how 74,000 years ago it knocked the human race down to a few thousand people. We saw. I'm sure you saw it because I thought of you when it happened. I saw that volcano that erupted in the middle of the ocean when you could see it from space.
Yeah,
fascinating eruption.
And here's the thing, Joe. I mean, if we were to have, like, if you go back to you heard about the year without a summer, 1816.
No.
Tambora, plus several other unknown volcanoes erupted within about a 5-year span. Tambora was the big one, Indonesia, and it disgorged huge amounts of ash and fine sediment into the atmosphere, which circled the globe. And basically, the summer of this was in 1815. The following summer, there was basically no summer. They were having 4th of July commemoration in New England, and it was snowing out. Wow. 4th of July. And this has been referred to as the last great subsistence crisis of Western civilization because there was famine, because you had agricultural failures. So you have this thing that you can begin to track now where you have primarily cold that's brought about by, I think, primarily volcanism is going to be the main instigator of this, but also I think hypervelocity impacts will also do, and we'll pull up some data here shortly that shows that hypervelocity impacts are way more common than was even assumed a decade, 2 decades, certainly a generation ago. That these things we've actually been rather lucky in the last few centuries that we've not had any major impacts. Tunguska of 1908 is considered the most recent great impact, and we can talk about that in a minute. You've heard of that, right?
Sure. Yeah, that's the one over Siberia.
Yes.
It impacted in the sky above the forest and flattened massive amounts of trees. Yeah.
Massive, yes.
That was one that erroneously they associated with Tesla for some reason. They thought that Tesla was doing something wacky.
I don't know.
Yeah, well, that's the Tinfoil Hat Brigade.
The evidence to me suggests very strongly that it was
Impact.
a piece of the Taurid meteor stream, which was a byproduct of disintegration of Comet Encke, which was in turn, and this gets us back to the British neo-catastrophists.
Is Encke named after the Sumerian Enki?
No, I think it was named after an astronomer who discovered it. Most comets are named after whoever discovers them. So, and it's spelled a little different, E-N-C-K-E as opposed to E-N-K-I. But coincidence, though, Encke. Anyways, so Comet Encke was probably part of a much bigger system, and it was probably Earth's encounter with the Taurid meteor stream that triggered the Younger Dryas impacts. That's kind of, a lot of the pieces are sort of fitting together now. And the Taurid meteor stream was a much more prolific meteor stream in the past than it is now. The Earth crosses the Taurid meteor stream twice each year. Peaks late October, early November, when the stream, if you got a picture, I actually have a graphic I can pull up in a minute, but you picture this stream circling the sun and going out to Jupiter and then circling back, coming around the sun, and it's laying into the plane of the ecliptic. Earth's orbit crosses that stream twice. So it crosses the stream when the stuff is coming in from out by Jupiter, and that's around Halloween. In fact, they've been called the Halloween meteors. Circle around the sun, and the second time the Earth crosses each year is late June, early July. But now that stream is coming right from the direction of the sun. So that makes it largely invisible, right? Because you're looking right almost into the sun. See, now when you look at the Tunguska event, it was June 30th, peak of the Taurid meteor stream. If you look at its position in the sky, where it came from, it was perfectly positioned to be part of that Taurid meteor stream. So it was probably, most likely, and nobody's proven it, but it was, the circumstantial case is very strong that it was a part of that Taurid meteor stream. And the Taurid meteor stream right now, the radiant, the place in space where the meteors appear to be emanating, is almost targeted right on the Pleiades, which is the shoulder of the bull, the constellation of the bull, Taurus. And there's a whole bunch of really interesting mythology associated with that we could dive into. But it's particularly like, for example, have you ever heard of Mithraism? Mithraism was in like 1st century AD, was the primary competitor to Christianity throughout the whole Roman Empire. And Christianity won out for a variety of reasons, but Mithraism was loaded with some really potent symbolism. And one of the things is that during the Mithraic ceremonies or rituals was called the tauroctony, the slaying of the celestial bull. And when you look at these images, they would go underground and they would have a vault-shaped like temple with stars painted on the ceiling. And at the end of that, they would have this carving of Mithras stabbing his sword into slaying the bull, the celestial bull, stabbing his sword into the shoulder of the bull, and the blood flowing out. And if you superimpose the constellation of the Taurus in the classical sense, the shoulder of the bull is the Pleiades. I look at that and I go, I think what they're trying to symbolize here is that on a yearly basis, they would see this meteor stream pouring out of the shoulder of the bull. And I could certainly pull up some stuff like that to look at. I thought really quickly, since before we leave the Atlantis thing, a couple of the things so now Solon is in Egypt, Sais, Egypt. He's talking to the ancient priests, right? And he says, thereupon one of the priests, who was of a very great age, said, O Solon, you Hellenes are but children, and there is never an old man who is a Hellene. Solon, hearing this, said, what do you mean? The old priest said, I mean to say that in mind you are all young. There is no old opinion handed down among you by ancient tradition, nor any science which is hoary with age. And I will tell you the reason for this. There have been, and will be again, many destructions of mankind arising out of many causes. The greatest have been brought about by the agencies of fire and water, and other lesser ones by innumerable causes. Wow. There is a story which even you, Hellenes, who don't know shit, you're like children with your knowledge. There's a story which even you have preserved, that once upon a time, Phaeton, the son of Helios, yoked his steeds of his father's chariot because he was not able to drive them in the path of his father, burned up all that was upon the earth, and was himself destroyed by a thunderbolt. Now here's the key passage. Now this has the form of a myth, but really signifies a declination of the bodies moving around the earth and in the heavens, and a great conflagration of things, all things upon the earth recurring at long intervals of time. So he's saying right there, okay, this has a form of a myth, but it's not really a myth. Behind the myth is something real, and it's the bodies circulating in the heavens. They decline or they descend to earth, and they set the earth on fire. So he's describing right there, you see, this whole phenomenon, and making it clear that there's more dimensions to what we think of as myths than just some mere fanciful, superstitious, concoction to try to explain the unknown. That there really is something going on behind there. That's, to me, really significant.
It's really fascinating, too, when he's talking about how there's no old science and that everyone is young. And it's really interesting when you think about someone from that long ago trying to make an account of what had happened to the earth with a relatively simplistic view of a relatively simplistic understanding of the sky, of asteroids, of volcanoes, of all these different things.
All these things, yeah.
Yeah, but the way they're describing it coincides. Once you have modern knowledge and understanding of these things, you go, I think I see what they were trying to say. That is so interesting.
Isn't it, though? Yeah, I mean, because Dorothy Vitaliano, who is a geologist back, I think she died in the early 90s. She was one of the forerunners of looking at the Atlantis thing and deciding that it was just a myth, that it was made up. Of course, when she was looking at this back in the 70s, she didn't have access to the data that we now have. Okay, she was the one who coined the term geomythology and said, you know what, we really need to be taking a closer look at some of the myths of old because they actually may contain really valid information about things that happened in the past. And of course, since then, it's emerged into like a whole discipline in itself, looking at stories like the one we just looked at. Phaeton is a story about a great meteor or comet or asteroid something, causing destruction on the earth. And Plato was saying, this is not just a myth, it's literal. Wow. It really represents.
Completely makes sense.
Yeah. And then he goes on to say, if any action which is noble or great or in any other way remarkable has taken place, all that has been written down of old and is preserved in our temples. Whereas you and other nations are just being provided with letters and other requisites of civilized life, and then, at the usual period, the stream from heaven descends like a pestilence. And I find the use of that term stream is interesting because we talk about a meteor stream, right? And we're looking at events that may have been caused by the influx of enormous amounts of cosmic material. And I think that's the best way to explain what happened at the end of the last ice age. A lot of the critics have tried to oversimplify it and say, well, you had just one object coming in, that can't explain it, right? But the ideas, the models that have evolved are not just a single event, but multiple events, almost like, again, back to the British neo-catastrophists. The idea of sort of an impact epoch, which has to do with meteor streams will precess. They will move. So there will be times when the Earth is crossing the stream and other times when the Earth is more or less missing the stream. It's just, the analogy I use is you're out driving down a country road and, you're all by yourself. You're listening to some tunes. You're kicked back. There's nobody else on the road. So, it's relaxed. You're not paying a lot of attention, right? Your probabilities of getting an impact are very low. But now you come up to an intersection, right? Now there's cars. It's a major intersection. There's cars going both ways. So now your probabilities of getting into an accident are going to increase by several orders of magnitude. Now, to take the analogy further, you'll know that sometimes there might, if it's 3 a.m., maybe your probabilities are low. If it's 5 p.m., your probabilities are high. And if you just shut your eyes and you cross that intersection, boom, you might get slammed. Same way, think of that. Think of a meteor stream, and in that meteor stream there are pockets where the material is denser and other places where it's spread out much finer. And there will be times of the year or times within, say, a millennia where you may have the Earth intersecting that meteor stream in a much more denser part than other centuries. During that period, you're going to have an increased probability of something happening. And I think this is the model that's emerging now, that we're realizing that the structure of space in Earth's vicinity is a whole lot more complex than we had previously even imagined a generation ago.
It completely makes sense, but it is horrific to think that the history of the human race and its survival is dependent upon, in a lot of ways, luck.
It is. Yeah. So I thought I would run through this. I call this Close Encounters. This is not by any means comprehensive, but I've been tracking this shit for decades now. So I call this Close Encounters. And I'm just going to go through very fast just to give the impression of what we're talking about here. Okay. We started out, this 88, that's when I started tracking this stuff.
1988?
Yeah, March 23rd, 1988. Earth just dodged this big asteroid. Now, we'll just go through and you can see 1989, giant asteroid makes close pass by Earth. 1991, near miss of Earth by small asteroid. Now, of course, the small asteroid can still do a hell of a lot of damage. Tunguska was a small asteroid. 1994, asteroid comes within 65,000 miles of Earth. 96, it was a close call for planet Earth. 2000, study raises number of dangerous asteroids. Later in that year, asteroid estimates too low. Asteroid makes close approach. Scientists worry over asteroids. Huge asteroid nearly misses Earth, January 7, 2002. January 7th, large asteroid passes close to Earth.
An asteroid large enough to wipe out France.
Yes.
Or it'll just pass Earth at a distance of 500,000 miles. So that's twice the distance to the moon.
Had it been on a collision course, it would have created one of the worst disasters in human history, said Stephen Pravdo, the NEAT project manager at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory.
And this is just 2002.
Yep.
How did it hit?
Yeah. March 8th, an asteroid large enough to have flattened the city buzzed Earth earlier this month and was not seen until after it flew harmlessly by.
Oh, my God. That's the thing about the sun, right? Like that it was coming from the sun, so it was coming from that same area?
In Tunguska, yes. Now this, unless you're looking in the right place for it, you're not going to necessarily see it.
I like the article, too, highlighting cosmic blind spot.
Yeah.
That's a terrifying thought.
Yeah. And then the same year, June 14th, asteroid 2002 MN gives Earth its closest shave in years. An asteroid the size of a football pitch, well, that would be, 100 yards in diameter, which is quite a bit bigger than the Tunguska.
That one's close, 75,000 miles.
Yeah.
That's really close.
That's really close.
Well inside Earth's orbit, or the moon's orbit, rather.
Same event.
Asteroid the size of a football field.
August 7th, near miss asteroid whizzes past Earth. This is 800 meters wide. Now, that's many times bigger than the Tunguska. This 800 meters could wipe out an area bigger than the state of Texas. And it would have global effects.
So 8 football fields.
Yeah.
And it can kill an entire state and probably put the entire Earth into some sort of a nuclear winter.
Yes.
There's
2003, closest asteroid yet flies past Earth.
88,000 feet.
2004, January 13th, Earth almost put on impact alert. Near miss raises rocky questions. Yes, it does. March 18th, asteroid soars past Earth oh so closely. 2005, February 4th, asteroid 2004 MN, a really near miss. Comet strike surprisingly more likely.
So we're just barely getting by. We're like a guy in an action movie where they're shooting at him and he never gets hit.
He never gets hit, yeah. Pretty much. So you can see, I'll just keep going here.
Well, for
in one
folks
day.
that are just listening, he's highlighting article after article after article, headline after headline. Asteroid just buzzed Earth, came closer to than the moon. And then here we go in 2013.
Yeah.
Fly by Earth.
See, we go from February 15th. Now there's another one that year, September 16th. That one was 1,300 feet in diameter, so 10 times more diameter than Tunguska.
40,000 miles an hour.
Yeah. Halloween asteroid resembling a skull.
Oh my God, it does. Look
Yeah,
at that.
doesn't it?
That's terrifying. We
Isn't
killed
that
by a
bizarre?
flying skull. So this is a very, very common thing.
Yes.
And we're just getting,
And it
oh my
just-
God, 27,000 miles?
Yeah.
1/8 the distance between the Earth and the moon.
Yeah.
So it's really common.
Yes.
And now we're just looking at when we could record it, when they can track it and measure it, which is within the last 100 years or so.
Less. 25 or 30 years.
Yeah. So
really?
with this taken into consideration, and then you go back, 11,000, 12,000 plus years, the amount of times that this has happened has probably been just off the charts.
Hundreds of times. Hundreds of times. Yeah. Here we go.
Snuck up on us. Scientists stunned by city killer asteroid that just missed Earth. City killer initially, but probably kill a whole lot more afterwards.
Yeah.
We were talking about Tonga earlier, the volcano that killed most people. It got the human race down to a few
Toba.
thousand. Toba.
Yeah, 74,000. Right.
Yeah, 74,000 years ago.
Go, yeah.
I think it got people down to a few thousand. They don't really know how many, but
Right. Genetic bottleneck.
But it's the same sort of effect, right? Because of the volcano spraying ash into the sky.
Yes. A volcanic winter would be very similar to an impact winter. Very much so.
So it's astonishingly common.
Yes.
600 miles in diameter? Oh, Jesus.
4 asteroids are buzzing the Earth in flybys today.
3 of them were discovered within the last 24 hours. This is 2019.
Yeah.
Wow. So it's actually possible that something is headed our way right now. We don't even know about it.
Oh, there's no doubt something is headed our way right now. I mean, yeah, because, see, these things, you got to bear in mind, these things are on orbits. And those orbits, you can track those orbits. And anything that's going to hit us in the future is on a trajectory right now that if we could discover it, track it, we'd go, okay, this thing's going to hit us in 2029 or whatever the case may be. So, yeah, so look at this.
2,000 feet wide whiz past our planet tomorrow, and this is 2019.
Yeah.
NASA admits we're not going to know when a space rock flies at Earth. There's a problem also with the gravity of the sun, correct? Like they don't quite see things that are headed our way just because of the mass of the sun, the way it affects.
Yeah, and what we're talking about with the Tunguska is that, if stuff is coming what you would call the perihelion passage, where it's passed closest to the sun, and now it's coming from around the sun, yeah, you'd have to basically look into the sun to see it. So it'd be very easy to...
Very easy to miss.
So here in June 2020, biggest asteroid to pass close and undetected this year.
Biggest asteroid of 2021 is going to zoom past Earth tonight, flying as fast as 100,000 kilometers per hour.
That's 60,000 miles per hour. 60,000 miles per hour.
Huge asteroid to pass Earth, and this is
Look at the date on that.
2021, 12/8. Yeah.
That was just not even 2 months ago.
Yeah. One that's 850 feet wide. NASA asteroid warning. Eiffel Tower-sized asteroid narrowly missed Earth in December. Jeez. Asteroid, this is January 11th. This is a couple weeks ago.
Yeah.
January 11th, an asteroid estimated to be 1 kilometer wide will pass Earth on January 18th. It will pass within 1.2 million miles of our planet.
Which is far enough that we're completely safe. But
Sort of.
in aggregate of all of this, what we're seeing is that unlike our conceptions of near-Earth space a couple of generations ago, we realize that there's all kinds of cosmic beasts that live in the space that we inhabit.
Yeah, because that 1.2 million miles is far, but it's not if you think about how vast space is.
Right. Yep.
Oh, boy.
Yeah. And there you can see from this
Okay,
graph.
look at this chart. Now, this chart's terrifying. Near-Earth asteroid discoveries. And then you look at the difference between 1980, where we had very little understanding of this, and 2022. Well, this goes to 2020, I guess. What is the end of the chart?
Around 2020, yeah.
So at the end of the chart,
probably more like 2018, I think, when this chart was done.
and because of scientific discoveries and the ability to measure, it's off the charts.
Yeah,
It's crazy.
it is.
Oh my God. $5 billion asteroid. So what is in this asteroid? Is it
Well, they got all kinds of
rare
precious
minerals?
metals in them,
Yeah.
which is very interesting because that opens up some possibilities for the future if we, the human species, are up to it.
If we can figure out how to mine them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's companies already forming around this idea. I wouldn't be surprised if Elon is thinking along these lines.
When you're thinking about something that's going 60,000 miles an hour and it's as big as, multiple football fields, how prepared are we to even deflect something like that?
At this point, we're not.
We're just not.
We're not. We're sitting ducks. We're screwed.
Ugh.
We're screwed. So,
Do you have canned food in your house?
yeah, I got about 6 months worth.
Do you?
I do, yeah. Yeah.
That's not quite enough, is it?
Probably not. It could, yeah, because really, we've got about 6 months worth of food before our food starts running out
For the world?
for the world.
Yeah.
So, if we had a dusting, a cosmic winter, a volcanic winter, that shut down agriculture for a year or two, half the population of the Earth is going to be dead within the next year. That's not an exaggeration. So,
Well, also you have to deal with the mammals dying as well, right? Because they're going to be without food.
yeah. You're going to have... See, now we get into a mass extinction level event. We had that at the Younger Dryas. If you think of all of the megafauna is over 44 kilograms body weight, or about 100 pounds, right? The planet lost about half of all megafaunal species during that Younger Dryas. Now, there was already animals disappearing leading up to it because I think could be attributed to whatever happened at 14,600 years ago, where I talked about earlier meltwater pulse 1A, right? That's when the shit really started to seem like it started coming down. And then it peaked, Younger Dryas, 12,850. And then we had the impact winter for 1,300 years. And at the end of that, it wasn't a gradual warming, it was a catastrophic warming. And by that time, I think whatever species had managed to survive some of the earlier events may have succumbed at that point. The controversies come down to, was it nature? Was it climate? Was it human hunters? I think it was all of that, but I think hunters was probably a minor contributor to it because, for one thing, it now appears that the human population took a major crash at the same time. Like, we see that there's evidence that the Clovis culture in North America pretty much completely disappeared right at that boundary. Well, they weren't the only ones around the planet. Now, if you go and you look at some of the archaeological evidence, one of the things you see over and over again is, well, there was this cultural group in Japan or wherever. I just read a paper on that recently. And apparently there was some kind of social disruption, and they got up and they migrated and moved away. Well, maybe they did, but maybe they didn't move away. Maybe they didn't survive. And there was a tendency to think, well, you have this evidence of cultural habitation of this area for centuries or millennium, and then suddenly you don't. Well, people must have picked up and moved. But maybe that's not the explanation. Maybe it's more a case of they got wiped out.
And one of the things you pointed out before is the evidence of there's certain mammals that appear to have died instantaneously, particularly mammoths.
Yes. Yeah. Woolly rhinos. Yeah, there's been a lot of what you might call flash frozen animals found in the tundra.
And they found large populations of them that seem to have died at the same time.
Yeah, mass death, mass mortality events. That's...
You showed some images also of what it looks like mammoths with broken legs.
Yeah.
That look like they'd just been blown away by impact.
Could have been.
Or the
something like the Beresovka mammoth. I think that's the one I showed, which was a mammoth that was frozen into permafrost, and it was I think 1901 was a particularly warm year that year in Siberia, and there was a collapse of the ground that exposed this mammoth, right? And he was sitting on his haunches, and both of his hips were broken, and he had food in his mouth and in his stomach. He'd been eating flowering plants, but now he was 6 tons in weight, and even the contents of his stomach had not putrefied, which meant that it got frozen. And the scientific study suggested that the entire carcass would have had to have been frozen within about 10 hours to prevent putrefaction of the material in the stomach. So how do you freeze a 6-ton mammoth in 10 hours? That's where it gets, that's the conundrum.
And a 6-ton mammoth that had just been eating flowering plants.
Yes.
Which is crazy.
That's crazy.
So something had to happen.
Something had to happen. Yeah, something happened.
And quickly.
And this poor woolly mammoth got buried and got frozen. And we know he got buried quick because he had an erect penis.
Hi.
Well, because that's what happens when you suffocate.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Like suddenly entombed. And his whole body is now under pressure. See? So, yeah, very interesting conundrum. There's a lot of those conundrums that are not readily explained through gradualistic scenarios.
Have you had a conversation with someone who's a blitzkrieg hypothesis, who is of the opinion that the vast number of these Native American animals, North American animals,
I have not,
rather,
but I'm pretty much familiar with most of the papers that they've written. And obviously, I think, like I said, I think that perhaps in the aftermath, there was a role for humans. However, when you see, the assumption is, again, that, see, what we know now about the lifeways of those late Ice Age peoples was that they hunted small game, they fished, they foraged. Mammoths would have been the largest, most dangerous animal to hunt. And when you think about the fact that if you look at the estimates for total global population back during the late Pleistocene, ranged from 5 to 10 million. The estimates that I've seen for the number of mammoths inhabiting the earth was about 12 million. So you've got at least one mammoth for every man, woman, and child, at least within the conventional interpretations, on Earth. Now, how do you exterminate not only the woolly mammoths, but the woolly rhinos, the mastodons,
North American horses,
the ground sloths, the horses, the saber-toothed cats, the giant short-faced bear, the cave bear, on and on and on and on.
North American lion.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So I just don't think it makes sense. Now, what's that based upon? It's based upon the fact that there have been a few sites that were assumed to be kill sites. Like, for example, at the Blackwater Draw, Clovis, New Mexico, they found a mammoth skeleton with a Clovis point between the ribs, in the rib cage. Then they did this major extrapolation from that, said that, this goes back to Paul Martin back in the 60s, did a major extrapolation from that and said, well, they were hunting mammoths. Well, there we go. There's the explanation. So they came across in this blitzkrieg, like we were talking about earlier, across the Bering Land Bridge, connecting Alaska to Siberia, came down through that ice-free corridor, slaughtering basically all of these animals in their pathway as they went. Never mind that no indigenous group culture that we've ever known in history has done that, right? They were able to slaughter, and I mean, we're talking about even the megafauna of South America underwent as great a mass extinction as those in North America. So within 1,000 years from Alaska to Tierra del Fuego, every megafaunal species was wiped out, or half of all megafaunal species. In North America was 3/4. Roughly the same in South America, were wiped out so completely that they couldn't even viably replenish their species. I think that that's really implausible. And now, basically, with the evidence that there was catastrophic events that coincided precisely with the major mass extinction episodes, and the fact that human populations seem to have crashed at the same time, well, what that tells us is that, probably, you don't have a catastrophe that's going to wipe out 12 million woolly mammoths and then leave humans completely unscathed. We see the Clovis culture basically disappearing at the Younger Dryas boundary. So where were the people that were able to affect this great extermination event?
If we have this estimate of Toba, of getting people down to a few thousand people, what's the estimate of the Younger Dryas impact and what it
I
had
have
on
not
them?
seen estimates, but I would speculate this. One reason it's escaped our attention particularly is because there wasn't a genetic bottleneck the same as Toba. Because basically that indicates to me, and this, again, I think the empirical data is consistent with this, the stories that we've inherited would suggest that there were dispersed survivors all over the earth. And so if you have dispersed survivors, we could miss a genetic bottleneck entirely. So, yeah.
So dispersed survivors would mean that you have people that do stay alive if they have some sort of access to resources. There's something that they could survive off of, whereas people that had been subsisting off of these animals that had gone extinct and also the climate had changed radically.
It's definitely going to be based upon that, your access to resources. And the habitat destruction is not going to be uniform. So there's going to be some places where, the damage is less severe. And there are going to be, in ecology, when you have a major environmental destruction. A few years ago, I went to Mount St. Helens to study how the nature was recovering in the aftermath, because you had a couple hundred square miles in the aftermath of Mount St. Helens back in May of 1980 that was just basically turned into a completely decimated lunar landscape.
Yeah.
But even within that, there were little pockets of ferns that survived. And from those ferns, you see life gradually beginning to proliferate outwards. And then with an increasing pace as the years go by. And so now maybe a third of the area that was devastated is being reclaimed. Forests are starting to encroach. Another few centuries, the mountain will be pretty much reforested. And so...
Which is a very small amount of time relatively for the Earth.
Yes. Certainly by half a millennium, I think you're going to be seeing forests completely recovering on the mountain.
It's such a fascinating subject because I feel like we're so underprepared and underinformed. I feel so few people are even conscious of like just that close encounter slide that you showed, and so many different asteroids have whizzed past us so closely, and how we're so accustomed to our supply chain, we're so accustomed to supermarkets, and this is the most vulnerable the species has ever been in terms of our ability to subsist. We're almost completely dependent upon these large structures. We're completely dependent upon supermarkets and supply chains that are coming in on trucks and boats and airplanes.
Yeah, and I got to say this, though. I think part of the problem is that what we've been looking at here has been kind of pushed off the radar screen because the whole emphasis for the last couple of decades now is, global warming.
Yeah.
That, we're responsible for catastrophic climate change. And what you don't want to really be talking about too much is that there has been repeated episodes, too many to count, episodes of catastrophic climate change that we had nothing to do with. We were not the perpetrators. We were the victims.
I think people that would counter that would say that doesn't mean that we should ignore the human impact on the climate.
Absolutely not.
Right.
I'm total agreement with that.
Right.
But I think that we need to have a realistic perspective
Of what's really dangerous.
Yes.
And we're really dangerous in the short term, like in terms of possibilities.
Yes, that would be my take on it.
And is there anything that we could have done differently to prepare ourselves for impacts? Like if this knowledge that you're talking about right here, if this had been widely distributed, say 2 decades ago, could there have been some methods put into place or something?
Well, if we had kept up the momentum of our space program from the 60s, we could be there now.
You think they would be able to have something that could knock
because
these things off course?
The DART, the mission that was just launched that's going to rendezvous with an asteroid, is to test the possibility of. See, here's the thing: if we can find an asteroid in orbit, right, we can trace its pathway into the future. We know, okay, we got 10 years, 20 years. That asteroid is going to be crossing Earth's orbit at the precise moment the Earth is there. This is how they were able to predict. Remember 1994, July, Shoemaker Levy 9, right? 21 objects slammed into Jupiter in July of 1994. That was predicted over a year in advance, right? So we had basically 15 months. It took from the discovery to the point where its trajectory could be predicted was about 3 or 4 months of observations. Over those 3 or 4 months of observations, the scientists, the astronomers were able to go, okay, it's tracing this arc of an ellipse at this velocity. Well, we can project that into the future, and we can recreate the entire ellipse, and we can, by using gravitational perturbation theory and all of that, we can predict that, 15 or a year from now, now this was after 3 months of observation, a year from now, it's going to be back out and it's going to be crossing the orbit of Jupiter. Well, guess what? It's crossing the orbit of Jupiter at that precise week that Jupiter is there. So they were able to predict a year in advance, right down, to the day when those impacts were going to occur. Same thing with Earth. If we had enough lead time, that's the key. And then the technology's in place. The technologies would be the simplest thing, I think, and the one that makes the most sense to me, is that if you catch it early enough, a direct hit, a little nudge, could turn a direct hit into a wide miss.
And how difficult is it to calculate whether or not it's going to hit us from distance? Like when they're...
If you've got enough observations, it's not that difficult. It's not that... Just like it was pretty much straightforward, you have what are called the orbital elements. And you can do some mathematical equations on those orbital elements, and that will tell you when and where it's going to be.
And so then they would just shoot some sort of rocket at it and knock it off
Probably
course.
The best thing would be you actually just go and attack. And I think that what the DART mission is looking at is actually attaching an object with booster rockets on it, attaching that to the asteroid.
And pushing it.
And push it. And now a direct hit is a miss.
Right. And is it the same thing like you would think about with a ship, that if 2 ships are going in a parallel line, if you just knock one of them slightly off course over time, it's far...
Yes.
Oh, okay.
That's exactly the idea, Joe.
Yeah.
Exactly. Now,
has anybody ever contacted you about this stuff from the government?
What's that?
Has anybody ever contacted you about this stuff?
Yes.
Really?
Now, this is a man that I would highly recommend you get sitting right here and talk to him. Lieutenant Colonel, no longer Lieutenant Colonel Matt Lohmeyer. Matt Lohmeyer was the head of the Space Force until he wrote a book criticizing the pandemic of wokeism infecting the military. So now, he reached out to me several years ago. He was a test pilot, highly decorated, highly accomplished test pilot in the Air Force. He got chosen to be one of the leaders in the Air Force. He got chosen to be one of the leaders in Space Force. He actually did. There's a video. I bet you Jamie could pull it up. If you put Matt Lohmeyer, Donald Trump.
We're connected to your computer today.
Pardon me?
We're on your computer.
Oh, okay.
So I can't. Sorry.
Is that the HDMI?
Yeah.
You could do it.
I guess I could
Well,
do
he's
it.
not on
Let's
the
try
internet.
it. Let's try it.
You're
and
not
see
on the internet?
We didn't. I don't unless he connected.
So Matt has been on, he was on Tucker Carlson after this happened. So he got,
So he had a criticism about wokeism, right? So like what particularly was bothering him about wokeism in the military?
well, he wrote a book about it, which I read like a year and a half ago. But basically just the political correctness and what you were allowed to talk about and not talk about. Irresistible Revolutions was the name of his book. So he published the book. He did a couple of interviews, and they canned him. Highly, highly skilled. That we spent probably several $100 million training this guy.
Jamie, will you text me this? Text me this guy's name and his book. I'll look it up and maybe I'll contact him after this.
Oh, he's already said that he would. He's
Yeah.
now in private life living in Idaho. But anyways, so he reached
Why
out.
do they
to
all
me.
go to Idaho?
Why?
A lot of them go to Idaho. I think they know something.
Maybe so.
A lot of them. All
Uh-huh.
those ex-CIA folks,
Yeah.
they go up there too.
Anyways, Matt is a great guy. He's articulate. He's well educated. He'd be a great interview.
Okay.
He would be a great interview. Anyways,
So
you asked me the question.
He
reached out
contacted
to me
you. He
like 2
contacted
years
you.
ago.
Yeah.
When he was still heading up Space Force and came and actually visited me in Atlanta. I was building the restaurant the T-shirt, the Wheelhouse Craft Pub and Kitchen. We weren't finished yet. He came there. We went and had dinner together or something. He wanted to know if I would be willing, if he organized all the base commanders, if I would be willing to come and address them and talk to them about planetary defense. And I said, absolutely I would. I'd jump at the chance to do that. So he was in the process of organizing it when the COVID pandemic started, and that just derailed the whole thing. And then he was in the process of reorganizing it when they gave him the boot.
And so they gave him the boot specifically about his criticism of wokeism?
Yes. Yes.
But it seems like he's got a good point.
Yeah, very much so.
Imagine you find a guy who's got a good point, and instead of going, hey, man, thanks, you fire him.
Right, you fire him.
Not good.
Not good. No. And he'd tell you the whole story.
Well, the wokeism has accelerated at a very high rate. I can't imagine being someone in the military that has to make pragmatic decisions and decisions, life or death decisions that are often very uncomfortable. And you need some hard-nosed, realistic individuals implementing these. You can't do that under the guise of wokeism.
That's right. And Matt was highly, highly qualified to do, top of his game. His resume was very impressive. And for the woke military, this to just, sorry, you can't say, you're not allowed to say that. And so, yeah, he got the boot.
It's a fucking strange time, Randall.
God,
so
is it?
that was the only person that's ever contacted you about doing something about this, about putting something in play.
Yes,
Maybe.
but that would see, what he told me was that a lot of the younger base commanders were really interested in this idea of planetary defense. And he said this was not our primary mission. However, I think, and he believed that it was critically important. In fact, his connection may have been you and me. I think it was. I think he first heard you and me talking about about this subject at some point. I wouldn't have known which one. This is number 6 that you and I have been together on this, but yeah, he was. I think that's where he first, heard me, you and I talking about
That
it.
makes sense.
Yeah.
Well, hopefully someone is going to reach out again and someone will pick up.
If you're interested, I can set this up. I could call him.
Yeah, I would love
Anytime.
to talk to him.
He'd
Yeah.
be a great guest.
Sounds like he would be.
He would be.
Very interested. So what were we getting to before that? We were talking about ways that we could possibly divert and whether or not it's feasible. And there's essentially no plan right now.
Correct.
That doesn't comfort me.
It's not comforting. No, it's not. It
We're
is not
just sitting there
comforting.
waiting. I mean, we make all these grand plans for the future of our cities, and we're worried about political, problems, and which party's going to control the House. And
I got to say, though, I suspect I would not be a bit surprised if Matt got reinstated once the political climate changes. The other thing is U.S. government has dropped the ball for the most part. And what we see now is the private space program stepping into the void.
Right.
So I'm very much a proponent and an advocate of that. I believe that it's our destiny to move into space, and I think that if we don't, we're going to go the way of the dinosaurs eventually, and maybe our species won't get extinct. But the point is, and this is, I think you're seeing this, and the point of what we're talking about is that our civilization is actually way more vulnerable than we've assumed.
Well, I think this pandemic alerted people to that, because something that had a very high survival rate still completely disrupted the world economy, completely disrupted us. Yeah, in most ways.
Yeah, so imagine a Tunguska-type event times 100.
Right.
We're really screwed.
Yeah, we're really screwed.
And this is not some science fiction scenario at all.
No, not by any stretch of the imagination. This is science fact.
Science fact.
Yeah.
I'm looking here. I'm not getting online. Let's see.
You have to type in we didn't do that yet.
What's that?
You have to get on the Wi-Fi and stuff. We didn't give you the password, so you couldn't be online.
Can we do that?
Yeah,
Sure.
Jamie. I don't remember what it.
I'll just do it.
Okay, here, Jamie will set it up for you.
Oh, super.
We'll pause here, folks, and we're
Excellent.
back.
All right. Let me get up Google Maps here.
Does that thing? Why does it have such a big base to it? Is that all battery?
I guess. Yeah.
You don't know?
I'm not that much of a techie. I let people set these things up for me, and I just...
Well, you have so much information in your head, I don't know how you would have time to be a techie. When you're given 18-hour lectures on Atlantis.
Well, not all at once.
I know, not all at once, but where's the time for anything else? There's no time to wonder about equipment in terms of computers and stuff.
Oh, yeah. Here we go. Let's see. Layers, terrain. That's what I want right there. So we were talking earlier about, meltwater pulses and catastrophic melting and so on.
Yeah.
We did talk previously about some of this research that I've been doing out in the Pacific Northwest. Mm-hmm. And we're zooming in on here, eastern Washington. And what you see here is what is called a channeled scabland. Now, you can see there's these darker areas, and then there's the lighter areas. Okay, this whole area, this whole thing that I'm circling here is the Columbia Basalt Plateau. Basalt is a lava rock that extrudes from the earth and it solidifies. In this case, the lava rock is dark. It's covered by 100 to 200 feet of soil called loess. It's a type of unique, very fertile soil that it's accumulated on top of the basalt rock. Okay, so at the end of the last ice age, there were a series of meltwater pulses that discharged off the ice sheet, and it washed away the topsoil and exposed this dark basalt underneath, right? So this is called a scabland tract, and I'll show you some photographs of it. You got one big scabland tract here, another one here. You've got this, what's called Grand Coulee over here, which is a huge canyon-like feature that was cut by meltwater. You've got another, what's called Moses Coulee. Let's zoom in here. You see this kind of arcuate form here? Kind of looks like a half circle. Mm-hmm. Okay, that's terminal moraine. Now, terminal moraine, if you picture this, Joe, you've got a glacier tongue coming down, and as it's coming down, oversimplified, but it gives the idea. It's bulldozing up material. It's pulverizing the ground underneath. It's pulling up, and then, so this moraine here is basically exactly defines the end or the edge of this glacier lobe that reached all the way back up into here over the Canadian Rockies. Well, sometime between 12, say, and 14,000 years ago, there was a series of massive meltwater pulses that discharged off the ice sheet. And this thing here, for example, is called Moses Coulee. And Moses Coulee is basically a giant scar in the earth that was cut within a matter of probably a week or two. It's 800 to 1,000 feet deep and up to 1 mile to 2 miles wide, right? So I've been exploring this.
That was a week.
Yeah, about a week.
What makes you say that?
Well, a lot of things. It's mostly the studies because we know the peak discharges. And we're talking here, both Moses Coulee right here and Grand Coulee up here had peak discharges of about 300 to 400 million cubic feet per second. Now, how much is that? Well, you can't even begin to wrap your head around what 300 million cubic feet per second means. But if you were to take every single river on Earth, every river, Mississippi, the Columbia, the Mackenzie, the Yukon, the Orinoco, the Amazon, the Congo, the Nile, the Po, the Yellow River of China, all the rivers of Earth, add them all together, you'd still have to multiply that by at least 10 to 20 to get a peak discharge of 300 to 400 million cubic feet per second. So
all the rivers of the world.
All the rivers of the world.
Times 10.
Times at least 10. At least 10. And I'm going to show you here now. We're going to pull up. Now, of course, this is just one area. Now, the reason I'm drawn to this particular area, and oh, by the way, I'll mention this. In April, I'll be out here with Graham Hancock. Graham is doing a Netflix series. Now, when he was writing his book, Magicians of the Gods, I took him. We guided for 2 weeks. We started at Portland and ended in Minneapolis. And what we did was we followed the margin of the great ice sheets. So I basically was showing him all of this evidence for these catastrophic meltwater discharges. If you get the book, Magicians of the Gods, I think 2 or 3 chapters, he talks about our journey together. So the Netflix episode we're going to do is we're going to go to Grand Coulee. We're going to go right here to this feature. And this is a giant extinct cataract feature, like a gigantic version of Niagara Falls, but many, many times larger. And there's no flowing water here now because it was a temporary giant discharge of meltwater. When that meltwater finally passed over the landscape, drained off into the Pacific Ocean, it left these giant fossil features here. And you can see, here's a highway right here, right? This building here, the Dry Falls Visitor Center, is this building right here. And there's a picture of Graham and I. We're standing, let's see if we can see it. Here we go.
Isn't modern technology amazing? You just keep zooming and zooming on this map.
I know.
From space, and you're just doing it on a laptop.
I know. It's fantastic.
Wild.
Well, you can't see, but we're standing right down here overlooking this feature.
Okay. And so this feature is widely recognized as a dry waterfall. This is not like a controversial thing?
No.
And what is the conventional reason for that existing? Is there some sort of an explanation?
Reason is that over here in western Montana, there was a giant lake, and that lake was held in by an ice dam right in the area of Lake Pend Oreille. And the water backed up 2,100 feet deep behind the ice dam. The ice dam gave way, and all this water spilled out and then spilled across the basalt plateau. That's the conventional explanation. I have strong issues about that explanation for multiple reasons. The main reason being is that ice is very unstable. And if we look at modern ice-dammed lakes that we've seen in the last, say, 100 years, they're typical, their peak discharges and their peak volumes are typically like only 1,000th or less. Even the big ones are only about 1,000th the volume of this. I believe, and others I think are starting to believe, that we're actually looking at some kind of an accelerated melting. Because for one thing, the conventional explanations for this giant lake do not ever explain how that lake got there. Let me just go back to here, and I'll show you. Let's see, Cataclysmos 1. This should give it to us right here. And you'll see the configuration of
Missoula. So this is Montana?
Yeah. So here we go. This would have been showing graphically kind of the configuration of the ice at the late glacial maximum. And
so this is what time period? How many years ago?
This would have been about 16 to 20,000 years ago. And here you go. Here you can see the two ice sheets, the Cordilleran and the Laurentide. And this is the area where the ice-free corridor would have been that we were talking about. This box right here shows the area of the Missoula floods, they're called. Let's just go find us. There we go. So here, this would have been Lake Missoula, and this would have been all of the area that we were just looking at where it's eroded. All that water would have come down, flowed through the Columbia Gorge here. This Portland is right here, would have turned north, and right here at Astoria, it would have drained into the Pacific Ocean. There was so much water coming down here that it backed all the way up through Willamette Valley and formed a temporary body of water 400 feet deep, where Portland now is, which would have completely submerged Portland, right? So this is basically the configuration. Now, there you can see this would have been the ice dam. Let's see here. So I could go back to the maps. That's the lake. So this was a very controversial over because J. Harlan Bretz, who was the geologist who first theorized this. Let's see. Here he is right here. He was considered a crackpot because he was talking about giant floods back in the 1920s and 30s. But, of course, he was proven right and ended up being the recipient of the Penrose Medal in his 90s.
So he was the first one to speculate?
Yeah.
And what was his reasoning? Like, where did he see the evidence for some sort of a flooding?
He was doing research along the Columbia River, and he kept seeing evidence like of these gigantic gravel bars and boulders and things that seemed out of place. And he actually, in fact, in 1910 is when he got interested in this, and he saw, in fact, I'll pull this up. I'll go back to Google Maps, and there was a newly released map that came out that was this feature right here. And in a minute, I'll show you some drone footage of this feature. This new topographic map came out in 1910, and he was regularly getting maps. He loved to look at maps. And he was looking at this feature, and he said, what the hell is the explanation for this? And this is what started him on this quest, this thing right here. It's called Potholes Cataract. And Potholes Cataract is a giant erosional feature in the basalt, the edge of the basalt plateau. And the water came from the right. And what you have here, we'll zoom in. You see this kind of round hole right here?
Yes.
That round pool? That is a result of what's called colking. This is colking. When the water gets so turbulent that it's doing this, like a tornado. And it literally can drill into the rock in a matter of days. It can drill. And what you see here is the evidence of gigantic turbulence. And this is called a recessional cataract. So as the water pours over this, picture you've got the rock. Okay, so the water is pouring over it. And as it pours over, it's eroding the wall of the cataract back. So it's receding. And then it's going to keep receding until there's no more water. And at the time the flood spigots are turned off, you're now left with this fossil feature.
Is there a geological formation, like a style of, like, what you're calling it, colking? Is that what you're saying?
Kolking.
Is there something that it does to the walls of that particular lake that make it evident that it was done that way? Like, does it leave like almost like a water drill? Like, you know, a drill would leave markings.
Is the holes drilled into rock.
Oh.
That's the evidence. And yeah, and I mean, we can see turbulence in modern water flows. But the thing is, to do something like this, you have to have extremely deep, extremely fast-moving turbulent water and sustained for maybe in this case a few weeks.
So a few weeks made that lake just by water
spinning.
Oh yeah,
a few weeks made this whole
stone?
feature right here. And what you have is you have two alcoves. Here's the north alcove and the south alcove, separated by what's called a rock blade. And that rock blade, if that water had continued to pour over for another few days, that rock blade would have been gone. Completely gone.
So it's just spitting at a furious pace, massive amounts of water, and it's drilling into the stone. And how deep is it?
Well, we can kind of estimate, because the major discharge point of this water was right down here. And look at this terrain. That is a terrain that has been tortured by extreme shear forces of water. Here it would have been about 400 feet deep. The width of this is about 9 miles. So you got to picture a river, 400 feet deep, 9 miles wide, and it's probably moving at 50 miles an hour, the water. And so we can go over here. This is a ridge separating this basin area here from the Columbia River. There were another spillover point was right here. It also has two alcoves with a rock blade. If we go back to Dry Falls Cataract, which is up here, you will see two alcoves, a rock blade, and you'll see that there's now a separation here. Because what's happening is this rock blade is being washed away. And again, had the water flow continued for another week or two, this rock blade would have been gone.
Now, is there a conventional explanation for these features? Do they try to come up with some other alternative explanation?
No, it's gigantic floods. Gigantic floods, yeah. That's pretty much accepted at this point. What's controversial is what caused.
And the speed of it?
No, the speed of it's pretty much accepted.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
Even
yeah.
the speed of that caulking, like the cause of that's accepted?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
And what explanation would they give for something that is causing that much water to pass through an area that quickly?
Well, the draining of this lake.
Right, but that doesn't make any sense to you.
Doesn't make sense to me, no.
But this all coincides on the timeline of the Younger Dryas impact theory.
This is controversial, but yes, I'm thinking that there was at least maybe 3 episodes of catastrophic flooding imprinted in this landscape. The first one, I would speculate, was at 14,600. Second one would have been Younger Dryas, and the third one would have been 11,600.
Now, I know that they've found evidence of human beings in North America that predate 11,000 years.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Is there an understanding of, like, if this impact theory is correct and if it did greatly diminish the population of people that are living in North America, where did they concentrate? Where did the survivors primarily come from? Do we know that? No?
No, because it appears there was a hiatus of about a half a millennium.
Really?
And then you have a different cultural group showing up called the Folsom culture.
And they came from somewhere else?
I don't know.
They don't know.
Somebody probably has ideas on it. I don't know. But, you know, I would like to be 3 people. Then I might be able to research all of this.
Because I'm just thinking, like, where would be a safe place to survive? Like, with the melting of these ice caps at such a rapid rate, and
you would not have wanted to have been in North America.
You don't want to be in Wisconsin.
No, you don't want to be in Wisconsin.
No, so you don't want to be in North America. Period. Even in Mexico, even all the way down there.
Mexico was. Let's see.
Oh
here.
my God!
So I'm gonna pull forward here. Let's see if we can get. I'm gonna show you some. Oh, here we go. Potholes Coulee. So here we go. This is drone footage of what we were just looking at. There's the rock blade. We're looking right at the rock blade.
Oh, God, it looks like something that was destroyed by water.
Water is coming towards us.
It makes sense if you look at it from above. It's so much different. Topologically, when you're looking at a map and it shows the features, it makes sense. But this, you go, when you saw that one rock feature that you just showed, you go, oh, yeah, I could see that being from water. I mean, it just, from what I know about erosion, it's not a lot, but it completely makes sense. It just looks like it. And so this was all carved by water, and this was all carved very rapidly.
Very rapidly by floods that are really way, way beyond anything experienced in historical times.
And so the idea is that these impacts is the idea that they slammed right into the ice cap?
That's what I think. That's what I would theorize.
And because of the extreme heat and the extreme velocity,
it has the. I mean, you're looking at one impact could be the equivalent of 1 million atomic bombs.
Holy shit!
Oh yeah. So look at this rock blade here, and here you can see. Look, there's that round lake we were looking at.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you can even see people in this. I've got one where some of us are standing on the rock blade, and we look like little specks.
When you're looking at it from this perspective, God, it does make sense. It makes sense that this is water caused, and that this is by massive amounts of water.
Yeah,
but my understanding of erosion is not enough to understand that this was done quickly.
Well, as I have said,
it makes sense.
You can look at photos, you can look at stuff like this. You don't really comprehend it, though, until you've been across those landscapes and experienced them firsthand, knowing what the story is. You come away, I mean, it's almost like an acid trip in a way. It's so mind-stretching when you begin to see this stuff firsthand that you really realize, oh my God, there have been forces unleashed on this planet that utterly dwarf anything that we humans have yet been able to do.
So is there any estimation at all about what size the comet was that impacted the ice caps, or how many of them?
Well, see, this is such a new idea, and it's still at this point very controversial. But I think, some of the Comet Research Group is looking at that. And see, this is a whole area of research that has been looked at by paleohydrologists who have not been astronomers, right? Now you've got astronomers who are looking at, let me pause this for just a second. It's like we're in this area now where we're starting to see the overlap, this interdisciplinary overlap. Because paleohydrologists have been looking for purely terrestrial explanations for this, right? Now, before 2007, nobody even was thinking the possibility of a hypervelocity impact into the ice sheet, other than myself. Maybe.
Wow.
And of course, who am I? I'm nobody.
Right. But that's pretty crazy. Like, what if you didn't exist?
What if I didn't exist?
Yeah, that's one of the things that freaks me out about humanity is that there's occasionally these figures, and if they didn't exist, everything's different.
Well, I've had this obsessive hobby for over 40 years.
Yeah,
I've
what
read
are the odds?
10,000 scientific papers. I've covered, you met Brad. Brad and I alone have covered over 150,000 miles in the field.
That's what I'm saying. What are the odds that someone like you is even real? Like, if you were in a movie, I'd be like, what? What is he doing? He's just, you know what I'm saying? I know you're real. But, I mean, I remember meeting you at the Punchline in Atlanta.
Yeah.
And you hitting me with all this information. And I guess I had just started the podcast then, because this was, you were saying, your friend Brad was saying 2009, right?
Yeah.
That's when we met, because he was there as well. That was the first year of the podcast. I mean, it might not have even started, or it might have just started. So you, in that one conversation that we had at the comedy club, you sparked this interest in my mind. But I remember talking to you thoroughly blown away, and then leaving that club with a completely different thought process when it comes to like the history of life on North America and the world in general, and this whole impact theory that you had been working on for so long.
So I successfully corrupted you
instantaneously.
At that point. Yeah, good.
I mean, we probably talked for like an hour or so, right?
We did, yeah.
Yeah,
and I remember it was noisy in there,
Yeah.
but we were like,
locked in, man.
Locked in.
I wanted to hear about that.
Yeah. And then how did I end up? Well, it was Graham that suggested you should get me, and you told Graham, I met that guy.
Yeah,
in Atlanta.
That's right. Yeah.
So blame it all on Graham.
Because Graham was one of my first guests. Graham, it was Duncan Trussell and I and Graham, and that was early on in the podcast because I had read Fingerprints of the Gods. I had read, his whole idea of this restarting of civilization and this concept that we are a civilization with amnesia.
Yeah.
And that something had happened. And it's really cool to see him, because I remember back in the day, I'd bring that book up and people would call me, crazy, fringe, conspiracy-loving
people who hadn't read
moron.
the book.
Yes,
yeah.
most of the people that hadn't read the book. But once Göbekli Tepe emerged, and then Dr. Robert Schoch from Boston University, who started examining the water erosion on the Temple of the Sphinx, and all of these different pieces came into play where you have undeniable evidence of an advanced civilization that's making massive, complex stone structures, concentric circles, all these different structures, like 11,000 plus years ago, at a time where they thought people were just primarily hunters and gatherers. And then watching them try to take this hunter-gatherer theory and apply it to these incredible stone structures that didn't make any sense at all.
Doesn't make any sense.
No. And it's really interesting. Also, it gave me an understanding of science and scientists in an unflattering way. Not that they're all like this, but there is a problem when someone proclaims a very specific thing. They have a thing that they've been teaching, they have a thing that they learned, and they have a thing that they subscribe to in terms of a timeline, in terms of and then any new evidence does not get treated like evidence. It gets treated like an intruder. It gets treated like a threat. And you watch them argue it with, like, I remember when Graham Hancock was there with Zawi Hawass, and there was another man who was an Egyptologist, and
Mark Lehner.
Yeah, mocking this idea that there was an advanced civilization 9,000 years ago. Yeah. Well, now, of course, we know that's true. Now there's no ifs, ands, or buts. So then you have to relook at the old style, old kingdom construction of Egypt and how different it was than the later years, and the fact that it was all under sand and that they had to excavate this stuff, and that you have two completely different styles of construction, and the old stuff is really complex. Not just really complex, but insanely difficult to do. Like, how are they having these massive stones that are cut so beautifully and perfectly, and they moved into place, and what are they doing? Like, how are they getting the stones for the king's chamber from 500 miles and away?
Have you ever been to Egypt?
No, I have not.
Well, when you go there, which you will, I'm sure.
I have to go.
Yeah, you have to go.
It's number one on the bucket list.
Number one on the bucket list. Maybe I'll be joining you.
I would love that.
That would be awesome.
That would be awesome.
But down near the Aswan Dam, there's a place called, it's the unfinished obelisk that you can see where they're cutting it out of. Right, it's still in the bedrock. And this thing is massive. And you go, okay, how the hell were they going to move this thing? I mean, it's massive. So
how did they move those things? I mean,
well, that one wasn't moved because it looked like they never finished cutting it loose from the bedrock.
Right.
But you see these massive stones. I mean, the Sphinx Temple has massive stones. Menkare's temple, massive stones. And then you go all these other places like Graham has documented.
Yeah.
And this is kind of where Graham and I, where our work kind of complemented, and I think how he and I first connected was, I'm not sure about the first connection, but in any case, what he kind of focused on was the evidence for something in terms of civilization. And he was theorizing that there was a catastrophe, right? I was focusing, on the other hand, on the evidence for catastrophic events. So his research and my research sort of complemented each other.
Perfectly.
Yeah.
Yeah. The podcast that I did with you guys, the first one, was one of my favorite podcasts ever because it was such an aha. Like, aha, I see. with Graham's, and it also it helped Graham's work so much because it gave a real a context to why this would have taken place.
Right. Yeah, and again, like you said, he was dismissed early on.
Yeah, mocked openly.
Mocked, yeah. But it was not justified.
No.
Because, we've gotten locked into, or mainstream academia has gotten locked into these models of history, and they don't want to let go because for many reasons. And I think one of the reasons gets into politics. It has to do with our conception of who we are, where we're at now. We're supposedly in the midst of the 6th great mass extinction right now that we're causing. And like you said earlier, to recognize that there have been these gigantic catastrophes and mass extinction events in Earth history is not in any way to say, well, we just should have a free hand in doing anything or whatever.
Right, of course.
Not at all, although some people will interpret it that way, But the thing is that we now have to recognize the reality that these events have happened, and we have not been the perpetrators of them. We have not been the perpetrators of these previous mass extinction events. We've been the victims, right?
Yeah.
And so right now, though, the whole thing, and it gets back to the global warming thing and all of that, is that, and I don't really know if we want to get into that whole discussion because it's worthy of several hours in itself, but, it's control. And what we see now is with the whole COVID thing and global warming, we're seeing proponents of global warming saying that, oh, well, hey, if we lock people down into their homes, they're not going to be driving cars. If they're not driving cars, they're not putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Hey, what a great thing. Let's, when you look at the net zero scenarios, I mean, I don't even want to get into that right now, but if you get into and you begin to look at it, you realize, well, basically what they're going to do is they're going to essentially render us impotent. They're going to render modern civilization impotent. We're going to be... If
they implement these sort of net zero policies.
Yes.
Someone of would it be a climate scientist or someone who would theorize that the way to do it is to make sure that people don't go anywhere. That way they don't emit any carbon.
Yes.
Yeah. So when you look at these global cooling events, like ice ages, they seem far more terrifying than warming events. And again, this is not to justify driving around cars that spew black smoke
Absolutely
out.
Not.
Doing whatever we want to the earth. But what we should really be scared of more is a cooling event than a warming event.
Absolutely. Because, again, in history basically testifies to the truth of what you just said. Because warming periods, again, I've written and actually lectured on this quite extensively. Warming periods are usually periods of prosperity because you have an extension of the growing season. You have periods like if you go back to the medieval warming period, which was roughly from 1000 AD to 1300 AD. This was the period where, and when you get to Europe and you go particularly to France, take a tour and spend a week going and seeing some of the magnificent cathedrals and realizing when you're looking at these unbelievably complex structures that would have taken, for the whole phenomena, you would have had to have hundreds of thousands of trained people working because you had stone cutters, you had stone carvers, you had sculptors, you had glaziers, you had carpenters, you had astronomers, you had engineers. They all had to be organized. They all had to be fed and housed and clothed. Well, you couldn't do that without surplus, right? That surplus we can now demonstrate, and this is something that's pretty much for the most part pushed off the radar screen, that the medieval warm period was a degree or two warmer than now. And what you had was you had agricultural surpluses that made that period of prosperity possible. It was preceded by what is called the Dark Ages cold period. During this time, it was very difficult because you had agricultural failures. You had cold spells that would cause they say that 536 to 540 AD was the coldest 4 or 5 years of the last 2,000 years. And you had population decline, you had increase of infant mortality. You had decrease in lifespan. When the warmth came back into the world, the sea ice retreated north. Now the Vikings were able to sail across the northern seas. Iceland became populated, became colonized. Vikings came to Greenland and were able to farm on the west coast of Greenland where it's now permafrost, right? In Europe, you had agricultural surpluses, so you had a huge increase in population between 1000 AD and about 1130. You had this ability to undertake this tremendous enterprise of this magnificent, glorious enterprise of cathedral building. The climate of the medieval warm period lasted until the late 1200s, early 1300s, and then it began to shift and became cold. And it was the first onset of what's called the Little Ice Age. And between about 13 right in there and about 1340, you had a succession of agricultural failures, which led to famine, right? That famine led to people being malnourished, which made their immune systems weak, and they now became susceptible to infectious diseases. And it was around 1340 that the bubonic plague swept over Europe because it was a result of the cold. And, of course, right then at that point, you see that between 1300 and 1340, that was the end of the cathedral building era. You can find the same thing happen in the aftermath, I said, 536 to 540 AD.
So the bubonic plague was a result of cold? I mean, it was
a result of the fact that people were weak.
Was one of the factors.
Probably the main factor.
But it was also like these pathogen-ridden fleas that were on rats and
exactly. But here's the thing: all of these kind of things are going to be more devastating if you have a population that's susceptible.
And they're susceptible because they're malnourished because of the cold.
They're malnourished because they're not getting enough nourishment. They're not getting enough to eat.
So they're already compromised.
They're already compromised.
So what's catastrophic during global warming periods is it's catastrophic for people that are living on the coasts.
On the coasts?
Because the coast, the ocean levels rise.
Yeah, I mean the ocean level has risen since the late 1800s, the ocean level has risen 8 inches.
But like when people are talking about global warming, there's many things that they're concerned with. But one of the things they're concerned with is cities like Miami that are like in porous ground that are right on the coast. Like that's going to go underwater in 20 years.
If the ocean levels keep rising, if they do.
Yeah.
However, I'm a bit skeptical because I won't pull it up now, but I could pull up and show you probably 500 articles on the importance of the sun in warming and cooling that have been mostly ignored in the IPCC's models and projections of climate change. And if we go into another solar minimum, like the Maunder minimum or the Spore minimum, we're in for decades of cold weather. And we're going to see ice growing again.
And what would cause those minimums? Like what causes those cold snaps?
Well, it's something internal to the sun. It's the sun. And the sun seems to have – see, when these global warming models were first being developed in the late 80s and early 90s, we were just at the very beginning of deploying solar observing satellites. And at that point, the model was the solar constant. So if the sun's radiant output is not variable, we can just ignore it. It's not a factor. However, we now have like 30 years of in-hand evidence that the sun is way more variable than was assumed 30 and 40 years ago. That being the case, the sun would now have a much more important role to play. Because, in the last 30 years, we've had massive amounts of new data from solar satellites that have been observing the sun. And so when the computer models were first being devised in the early 90s and stuff, the assumption was that the sun was not playing a role, and so we don't need to look at the sun. So you eliminate all the natural variables until only carbon dioxide is left. And that's pretty much where we're still at, because by the time you get into the 2000s and it was becoming apparent that the sun was actually a much more important factor in climate change and had been acknowledged, by that point, the whole scenario had already become entrenched. And you now had huge amounts of money being poured in to that whole scenario.
I was reading about how vulnerable we are to solar flares.
Yeah.
That's a terrifying thing because our grid, our satellite systems, our internet,
all of that, yes.
We're so vulnerable to just a weird but very common glitch of the sun.
We are.
That has been documented in history. Like there have been times in history where the sun had a flare and it blew out communication devices, right?
Yes. Let's see here.
Wasn't there something like in the early 1800s?
Yeah, the Carrington event. Let's see here.
Rodney Carrington? No, just kidding.
I don't remember his name. We'll just go through this really quick here. Let's see. In 2003, a flare was measured at X28, but was likely even more powerful. The sensors became overloaded under the explosive energy being measured. It was quite literally off the charts. Solar flares are mostly harmless and don't pose much threat to humans on the surface of the Earth. What could cause some problems, however, are coronal mass ejections, which are sometimes conflated with solar flares in popular parlance. We'll jump down here. A big blast in September 1859, a solar storm known as the Carrington event, named for astronomer Richard Carrington, who observed the corresponding solar flare the day before, struck Earth, causing widespread technological havoc. Even considering the comparatively primitive technology of the time, the magnetic effects were so substantial, the aurora, normally seen at polar latitudes, could be seen in the tropics.
Whoa.
Electricity from the storm flowed through the electrical lines of telegraphs, overloading the circuits, starting fires around the world and shocking nearby workers. The global lines of communication were disrupted until the magnetic storm trickled out hours later. Interestingly, some telegraph operators reported being able to send messages without the batteries attached, using only the currents in the air.
Holy shit.
If a storm of that magnitude were to strike today, the impact to technology could be catastrophic. Power lines could receive energy from the storm and spread it out. Because our power grid is interconnected, a spike in one region could impact areas which might otherwise be less affected, according to a NASA-funded National Academy of Sciences report from 2008. Transformers would be damaged and the power outages would occur around the world. Radio and satellite communications could be knocked out, resulting in a massive blackout without the benefit of being able to talk to one another. Now that would be pretty catastrophic. But now we have this. A signature of a cosmic ray increase in AD 7475 from tree rings in Japan. This was likely the result of a giant solar storm. And we don't need to go through all of this.
So this is 774 to 775
yes.
AD?
Yes. So what we're interested in is the conclusion down here. With our present knowledge, we cannot specify the cause of this event. However, we can say that an extremely energetic event occurred around our space environment in AD 775. In the future, other high-resolution records, such as beryllium-10 and nitrate data, together with careful research of historical documentation around AD 75 and further surveys of undetected supernova remnants, this was probably a solar event.
So our sun?
Yes. Causes, so we get into another article here, causes of the AD 774, 775 carbon-14 increase. Talking about the Carrington event. Such an event would cause great damage to modern technology, and in view of recent confirmation of superflares on solar-type stars, this issue merits attention. A Carrington-level event would be disastrous for electromagnetic technology, causing widespread damage to satellites and transformers linking the power grid. No assessment has been made of the technological effects of an event 20 times stronger, which the 774 event was.
20 times stronger.
Than the Carrington event.
And then there's also the possibility of hypernovas, right? Like outside of our galaxy.
Yes. I think this is going to be more likely, but yes. So what we're realizing, again, this is my point, is we've learned a whole lot about the sun. Mm-hmm. And that the sun is not necessarily the invariable star that it was assumed to be. Mm. Now, we just talked about the effects of a Carrington-level event. Now, he's asking the question, no assessment has been made of the technological effects of an event 20 times stronger.
You know, it's so funny because we talk about Plato, and you talk about Plato's description of what Atlantis must have been like, and also this idea that they were trying to make sense of the catastrophic forces of nature and comet impacts and all these different things. And we look back on their limited understanding of the universe and the world and all the natural forces, but we're kind of in a similar boat in comparison to the way people are going to look back at us. We just don't think about it because we're wrapped up in this timeline.
We are.
And we do have all this amazing technology, like we talked about, your ability to zoom in with your laptop and show the topographic features of this the landscape that indicates that it's been hit with all this water damage. But there's so much we don't know.
So much we don't know.
And so much we're not prepared for.
And this is why I think it's so important that we actually look at our own past and realize that our ancestors weren't these primitive, ignorant savages that we've assumed they were, and that their legacy that's been handed down to us may turn out to be extremely valuable in trying to understand the big picture.
It also makes sense when you think about Graham's research, Graham Hancock's work, when it makes sense that these people were very advanced in terms of their ability to grasp concepts and thoughts, but they weren't as technologically advanced because they were the remnants of a civilization that had to start over from scratch or close to it.
Yeah.
So really intelligent people that had to go without all of the knowledge and all of the creations of people from the past because most things had been wiped out.
Yeah. And this is what I think of as the real great reset. That when these kind of events happen, and civilization basically has to start over.
How many times do you think this has happened with human beings?
Well, I think if we look in the Holocene, it's probably happened half a dozen to 10 times. If we look at, the Bronze Age collapse, what's the cause there? It may have been volcanic and extraterrestrial. It may have, exogenic means from the outside, endogenic means from within. And I think there's times the perfect storm is when you get the simultaneous effects of both. There's some evidence now that would be suggesting that ET events, exogenic events, might actually be triggers for a terrestrial response. If you have an impact, like we know, for example, that there was enormous amounts of volcanism associated with the whole deglaciation phase, right? There was also very large earthquakes as the ice mass is being transferred from the land back into the oceans. You've got this tremendous mass transfer over the surface of the earth. That leads to a significant terrestrial response, which could be volcanism and earthquakes.
Completely makes sense.
It completely makes sense, and there's empirical evidence to support that.
I mean, just imagine what you're talking about. Any of those enormous asteroids that are flying by Earth, if they slammed right into Yellowstone.
Mm-hmm. In fact, David Alt, who is a geologist, theorized like at least 20-some years ago that about 17 million years ago, the magma plume that's under Yellowstone may have been caused by an impact of an iron asteroid punching through the crust and causing an upwelling. It's called pressure relief melting. That as long as you got this overlying cap, but if you remove it, like in the case of a hypervelocity impact, it allows the upwelling. And in fact, the whole Columbia basalt plateau that we were just looking at, that is the outflow, the basalt outflow from the magma plume that's now under Yellowstone. Yeah. So, and there's correlations. The Deccan traps in India correlate in age with the Cretaceous Tertiary impact of 66 million years ago that caused the extermination of the dinosaurs. The Siberian traps are associated with the Permian Triassic event of 245 million, which may or may not have been caused by an impact. I think it probably was, but at that long ago, it's hard to find the evidence. But that was the greatest mass extinction in Earth history. 90 to 95% of all species, terrestrial and marine, went extinct very quickly.
And what year was this?
About 245 million years ago, the Permian Triassic. And it was actually the transition from two of the great eons in Earth history, from the Paleozoic to the Mesozoic. So the Mesozoic was the great period of middle life, which lasted from about 245 to 66 million. And it was bookended by two of the great catastrophes in Earth history. Now, if either one of those kind of things happened today,
That's a wrap.
that's a wrap. No more people, unless we're living in space.
Well, I mean, we're the descendants of moles, right?
Something like that.
Yeah.
Lemurs,
Some kind of
something.
shrew thing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
God, it's just like these conversations make you feel so vulnerable. I mean, they're so fascinating and thrilling, and I can see why you've been on this decades-long obsession with it. But my God, it's so humbling.
It's humbling. But you know what? I have confidence in our species. In fact, I think our species evolved out of the natural order of terrestrial life because there were the one species that can be sitting here having this conversation. Dinosaurs couldn't.
Yeah,
Boom.
but we could easily get wiped out and start from scratch, and then
Yes,
a
we could.
new species has to pick up the slack. Some lizard people,
You're right.
45 million years from now.
But you see, I guess my optimism comes from the fact that you and I are sitting here having this conversation.
Well, that's optimistic. For us, we came about at a very interesting time.
Yeah.
What's that famous Chinese proverb? May you live in interesting times.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It
Is that
could be a curse or...
Might be a curse. Yeah, but that is where we're at. We live in interesting times. I mean, but it's also like the things that we took for granted that we thought were going to be here forever are now in full upheaval.
Yeah. Well, I think this is one of those times, where things are shaking out. And,
Very much so.
And I want to see us get back to being, I'm of the mind I like the adventurous, entrepreneurial spirit. I can't abide by this, we're going to get all offended because we're using the wrong pronouns or we're going to get triggered or whatever. Look, we've got some huge things in front of us that we're going to have to contend with if we're going to have any kind of sustainable existence on this planet for generations to come. And I think it's going to probably take a wake-up call.
But it's also the pressure that you're getting from these non-productive people that are trying to enforce like woke talk and things along those lines. They've chosen to try to control the thinking and behavior of other people rather than controlling their own personal creative output or their own personal success and their own personal progress. It's like it's what you concentrate on. If you're concentrating constantly on trying to diminish other people's ability to express themselves and to try to control the way they express themselves, like it's a poor management of resources and a lack of understanding about your own issues with discipline and self-reflection. And we're in the middle of that now because it's easy to do because of social media. Because you can express yourself so readily and easily through social media, it's very tempting for people. Then they get wrapped up in these kind of social media exchanges with folks. And it becomes an addictive part of your day, and it leads you to be even less productive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you've been around long enough. I've been around long enough to see how things have changed, since I was a kid growing up. My upbringing was rural Minnesota. Winters are very harsh. You worked your butt off. Everybody worked, and nobody thought that was exceptional. Everybody worked.
You have to in cold climates. That's one thing about cold climates is people really value hard work and hard work ethic.
Absolutely. And I marveled at my dad and my grandfather and thought, God, am I ever going to be able to work as hard as those guys did?
Yeah.
My grandfather... on my dad's side, he came over at 16 years old from Sweden on a cattle boat. Couldn't speak a word of English, came here, settled up in Minnesota, and started working. And worked in a sash and door company 10 hours a day, building window frames. He would then get off work, and he would go and he built a house. Now, when you're in Minnesota, all houses have basements. So he would get off work after 10 hours, and he would work till dark hand digging the basement. Built this house, married my grandmother, moved her in, and then immediately began building another house right next door by himself. Now, I don't know. I've done a lot of hard construction work, so I know what's involved with that. It can be extremely hard. Like my father, he would go, my father and my grandfather, when I'm a little kid, they're working together. They'd be out there working. It's 20 degrees out, 10 degrees out, so cold, and they're working outside. Here's what they would do. They would have a kettle. Right? They would build a fire, have a kettle, and they would put the nails in the kettle and heat up the nails. so that then when they're handling the nails were hot and would keep their hands from freezing. Now, you know, where are the men like that? I mean, they're still around, but I think that, you know, that kind of an attitude towards things seems to be diminishing.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, because it's easy to survive.
Yeah, it's gotten too easy.
Well, I don't know if it's gotten too easy, but it's gotten easy enough so that the path of least resistance becomes even more tempting to folks. And by the path of least resistance, the problem is you create resistance all around you. Mm-hmm. You know, and you create resistance for people that are trying to do their own thing, and you want to like control the way people view the world and define the world and the language that they use and the way they behave and think.
Right, and people are just, it's almost like you're looking to get offended.
Yeah. Well, you remember, I mean, it's literally in the Bible, the meek shall inherit the earth. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's literally what's happening.
You think that's going to happen?
I don't know.
What's going to happen to the bold?
Well, I think the bold will be challenged to try to find new ways around this situation. And I think also the meek will one day recognize that they really wish to be bold. Mm-hmm. And that's where our best hope is. Our best hope is that we can educate people on the value of discipline and creativity and hard work and the satisfaction that comes with accomplishing goals and projects. And also that social media communication is terrible for real world communication. It's terrible for the human organism. It's not the way we're supposed to communicate with each other. We're supposed to communicate with each other eye to eye, looking at each other, a shake of a hand, a hug. Yeah. We're supposed to be nice to each other.
Yeah.
That's very rewarding and it feels great.
Which brings me to something I'd like to bring up. I've been really busy since we've last met, and I've partnered with a new internet platform called HowTube that is growing rapidly.
HowTube?
HowTube, yeah. And it's basically very much First Amendment, unfettered speech. It'll be curated.
Nazis, a bunch of Nazis, right?
Yeah, a bunch of Nazis, exactly. Bunch of Nazi fascists, yeah. Right, yeah. Our plan is to take over and subjugate the entire planet.
But if you say that today, people are like, oh, First Amendment, free speech. Oh, you're into free speech.
We are definitely into free speech.
Yeah, well, free speech is fucking dangerous.
Yeah, and the other thing that's coming together sort of as a counterpart to that is a group of fellow people that I've been in worked with over the years, business. You know, I told you I built this restaurant.
Yes.
The restaurant's been wildly successful. Some of the key people, the entrepreneurs and investors there, we've come together. We're looking at land. We're going to build a center, an institute, a school, whatever you want to call it. We're raising the funds right now, and we're laying out the plans, and because of exactly what you just said, I think that education is at this point, it's a massive failure in America. I mean, it's gone down the toilet. And it's gotten so politically correct that every year the standards get lower and lower. I have worked in education. That was one of the things I did just because I felt it was so important. Back in the mid-'90s, I started organizing classes for kids that were being homeschooled. And I ended up for 15 years organizing classes. And over those 15 years, I developed ideas that were not really that original, and they were pretty obvious when you think about it. But here's what I would do. I was mostly mathematical based and science. So like one year, for example, I had 3 boys. We were had a science class, and we decided we were wanted to do something really cool. So we entered a science fair, a national science fair contest against, I think, over 3,000 teams. There was something like 13,000 students in this science fair. We came up with a concept. One of the boys in the threesome there, who were part of my homeschool class that I had organized, came up. He had a physical problem. He was, God, I don't remember what it was, but they had him on steroids that stunted his growth. And on several occasions, he had strokes, and he had to be taken to the hospital emergency. In class one day, he said, you know, the worst thing about, he was 9 years old. He said the worst thing about going to the hospital was the gurney ride. Yeah, I can believe that. So he says, I've been thinking, he says, I've been reading about how they have these magnetically elevated trains in Japan. And he says, could we apply that to a technology for gurneys, hospital gurneys?
He was 9 when he thought this
He was
up?
9 years old. And I said, let's see what we can do. We built a model, me and 3 of him and 2 other boys, entered the science fair contest, and we won 2nd place nationally. So I had students that I took from very beginning level geometry up through the lower levels of calculus, who then went on to do excellent academic achievement, have become doctors, scientists. You know, I just, in fact, ran into one of them just a few days ago while I was in Atlanta. Little boy had been in my class like 20 years ago, and now he's launched, he's an entrepreneur of a tech company that he's just launched, right? Anyways, out of this, I realized that, you know, the thing that I came to believe was that modern education has got so many things wrong with it. One, the stratification of modern education. Like, this is, to me, artificial. You know, if you look at traditional societies, when a kid, particularly I can speak from the boy's point of view, when a boy got to adolescent, at that point you were thought of as a young man, and you were integrated now into adult society, and you were expected to start behaving as an adult, right? Well, you know, we don't really do that anymore. It's like what we see so much coming now, I think, out of even the college-age kids is this, like, extended infantilism. You know, they come out and they're still, you know, look, you're supposed to go to college and be exposed to challenging ideas.
Yes.
Exposed to different points of view, you know.
Yes.
Instead, they're coming out, you know, and they're like, we don't want, you know, whoever to come onto campus. We don't want Jordan Peterson to come onto campus because he's going to expose us to ideas that we're scared of, you know. I think one of the first things we need to do is, like, move away from that. So what I would do is I would get a class, like, let's say we're going to have a class in geometry. I would take kids out to the building site, and I would show them, here's how we're using geometry to lay out this building, this house. And and the exact things we just learned in the classroom, look at how we're applying those. We'd get to a lesson on trigonometry. I would take them out to the job site, and I would say, look, here's how we're using trigonometry to design this complicated roof. We would go back to the classroom, and I would have the kids as a problem, as an exercise, figuring out what are the angles of the cuts, what are the compound miters we need to cut from the lumber so it all can fit together like pieces of a puzzle. And then we'd go back out to the job site, and they would see how it's all going together, right? I would take, in fact, and you know, one of the other things that's happened is that, you know, at the early 20th century, 80% of the American population was agricultural and rural. 20% was urban. Now those statistics have flipped exactly. I've known kids that were in college that had never seen the Milky Way. Never seen the Milky Way. Couldn't find the North Star if their life depended on it. But I think that that's part of the deficiency that needs to be corrected. And so I'll just show you a couple of quick things here while we still have some time left.
Are you going to have an online aspect to this?
Absolutely. That's the how-to. So it's 2 dimensions. There's there's the hard, you know, the hard facility, the hardware and the software. The software is going to be how-to. And we're actually just now putting up and promoting the whole concept of this idea of this school. So, like, here was the first class I ever did.
1995, Randall's first hands-on geometry class for young people.
Yep. Over 120 kids tutored in classes over the next 15 years. It is critically important to develop alternatives to the authoritarian, hierarchical, monopolistic system of indoctrination that now usurps the function of authentic education. This is how it started, see? And then I would take kids out. We would do geology and nature, science out in nature. So this group of kids are just taken out. We've been studying what happens to streams after storms.
Oh.
So I did this. I had probably 100 kids that I took out on these kinds of field trips. Like it says here, getting students out of the classroom into the real world of nature is vitally important to any system of education and promotes the psychological well-being of students.
So these were homeschooled kids?
These were all homeschool kids, yes. And here our homeschool trio beats 324 teams. This is little Mark, that little 9-year-old, and very sadly, about 2 years later, he passed away from his condition. Tore me up. And this was one thing when I got into this, I did not expect that I was going to be bonding with these kids. I've lost 3 of them. One was killed in a car accident. Another one had problems, and he hung himself. And so it was just, that was something, when I went into this, I did not expect that that was going to be an element, that I was going to get close to these kids and then grieve over their passing. Little Mark there, Mark McGinnis, he was 12 here. He was 9 when he actually came up with the idea. And then a couple of years later, we began to actually, hey, let's take that idea and go, see if we can enter a science fair contest. And we did. Like it says, we got second place nationally. And then so scientists discover a major lasting benefit of growing up outside the city. And I'll just jump to this. You can actually see that for kids exposed to nature, it actually affects structural changes in their brain. That kids that are growing up in a strictly urban environment now are being deprived of that. And studies are now showing that kids that are exposed regularly to nature grow up with far less psychological problems, lower levels of divorce, suicide, drug addiction, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think that this is the direction we have to move to start healing what has gone wrong with our society.
Do you think that maybe we've overlooked a component of development for human beings, that it's not just a choice whether or not you're around nature, but it's actually a necessity?
Absolutely. I totally think that.
It's something like a vitamin or something
Yes. And I consider myself extremely fortunate that I was able to grow up in a rural environment and be exposed to nature. I mean, my boyhood growing up was hiking, camping, swimming, canoeing, horseback riding. When I got old enough to work, we worked on the neighbor's farm, so I had that whole opportunity to see farm life and how all of that came together. And I look back on that now and I go, God, I took that for granted back then, but now when I look back, I go, boy, I was so fortunate to have that upbringing. And I think, God, more kids, young people need to have that kind of an experience growing up. So this whole thing that we're doing with this group of very incredible people that I've been working with for some now 5 to 10 years, some of them longer than that, are coming together around these ideas. And I don't know if you know Chris Martinson or does Peak Prosperity. He'd be a good, some great people that are intimately involved in this and going to help raise money for the first prototype. We're looking at land in eastern Tennessee as one place. I'm also looking at land in Arizona. I've got some people out there that I've been working with who are very much about trying to make something like this happen, to create a prototype that can, so look, here's a place. And see, another thing that I believe is that, and I did this in my classes, I said, okay, you pay for your tuition for your kid. As long as there's room, I encouraged parents to come in and participate, because I really believe that this whole artificial stratification by age is detrimental. And you need to, this horizontal stratification, to me, again, is debilitating. And we need to have a vertical integration. So that I found this in my homeschool classes, that I would sometimes have kids ranged from 10 to, say, 15 or 16. And I noticed there was a natural dynamic that emerged. The older kids would naturally become mentors to the younger kids, you see? And we'd have adults in there, and pretty soon it was almost like this, my generation, when we came of age, it was the generation gap. Have you ever heard that term?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, that was my generation, coming of age, the baby boom generation. We were the first to have that, right? Well, what brought that about? What brought that about was the the way that American education evolved, because prior to World War II, most schools in America were the one-room schoolhouse. Coming out of World War II is when you begin to have these large institutionalized consolidation of schools. Like it really accelerated in the 50s. My father was in a one-room schoolhouse until he got to high school, like in 1944, I think it was, 43. At that point, they had just built a brand-new high school that had like 800 kids, which was exceptional at that point. But when you go back and you look at it, what you see is the schools got bigger and bigger and bigger, and the bigger they got, the more impersonal they got. Now, when I started homeschooling, I was working with some of the teachers in the Waldorf system. Now, here's what they do. They come in, the Waldorf kids come in at the kindergarten age, and they'll have a teacher who stays with them all the way up until through middle school. Now, you have a small class of 10 or 15 kids. You have a single teacher. Think about the dynamic in the relationship. That teacher's going to know those kids. I found that when I was teaching courses in math, and I would have 6, 7, 8 kids, if one of them wasn't getting it, I knew instantly. And I never left anybody behind because we didn't have to. And I also found that, if this child was not getting it, this student over here was more than eager to jump in there and say, and help them. I found that was also something very important. And my memory, and you probably had the same experience, my memory was, when I was particularly middle school, bullyism was rampant.
Yeah.
I got my first year in middle school, I got bullied mercilessly. And then 8th grade, when I went to 8th grade, I had gone through adolescence, and I had also spent that summer between 7th and 8th grade working on the farm. So what we did on the farm was hauling in hay bales. Now, we'd have 80 acres of alfalfa. It would get cut in, hay bales back in those days. And so you go out there and you'd have to lift the hay bales up onto the wagon, and then the wagon, one of the other boys would drive the wagon. Sometimes one of the girls on the farm, girls, would be driving the tractor. Go back to the barn, unload that, and then you go back out and you do this all day. So by the end of the summer, I had gotten way stronger, right? I had calluses on my hands from doing that. So I went back to 8th grade, and the same guy, remember, he started right in bullying me. And about a month into school, we were in gym class together. I come out, and I've just got my underwear on. He comes out and starts whipping me with a wet towel. And I kind of lost it and didn't realize, his dominance of me was at that point purely psychological. But it shocked me how easily I whooped his ass. But it was totally because I'd spent the summer primarily doing this hard physical work.
Yeah, the hardest. Farmer strength is a real thing.
Yeah, absolutely it is. So, but bullyism was very endemic to that whole stratification, because what I observed was the bullies were always the kids, the boys primarily, that had been held back, right? So particularly in middle school, there's a big difference.
Older.
Yeah, you're a year older, 2 years older, you're bigger, but you're also got this insecurity about, this feeling of inferiority, because now you're been placed in your peers are these younger kids. It's just almost like an open invitation to become a bully.
It's also they're probably psychologically damaged, which is why they're not excelling at school in the first place.
Yes, but what
I probably getting bullied at home.
That's right. But see, I particularly like with math, I found that everybody, for math particularly, you got to see people. I don't know how many times I heard like a parent would come to me and say, "Well, little Mark thinks he's no good at math. He's been in public school and, he's fallen way behind." And I said, yeah, that's what happens. That's what happened to me in 8th grade. I fell way behind, and I got behind a year, right? Well, so I work with Mark, and get him in a different environment. And then he'd come to me and say, "Mr. Carlson, I didn't know I liked math." I have letters from both kids and parents saying, "Yeah, I didn't even know I liked math. Now I love math." And the reason is because you go back to square one and you explain something and you take it step by step. And what happens with math particularly, you get left behind. You know, you go to public school, they've got, here's what the teacher's got this, here's what we've got to cover, this, and this. If you fall behind, tough shit.
Yeah, you're never going to catch up.
You're never going to catch up.
Yeah.
What's the point?
Right.
What a waste of time.
Yeah.
My problem was I was a little bit on the upper end of the scale, so I just got bored to tears. And I would tune out because I got so bored, you know?
Well, I think that's a giant problem with the large classes where they just, there's no way they can concentrate on so many kids.
Right.
Their education falls by the wayside because of it.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
And so this is part of what, you know, and if you're interested, I will keep you in the loop
I would
as
love
this
to
thing
hear
evolves.
about this. Yeah.
Yeah.
I would love to hear about this. And I think one thing that's sorely lacking in school is the concept that there's jobs that are available outside of what we think of as mainstream occupations. Like there's not, like I'm not encouraging kids to become social media influencers. I'm not encouraging kids to become TikTokers or YouTubers, but
Right.
you know how much money those fucking people make? Like if you're encouraging people to become lawyers, like at what point in time do you encourage them to play video games professionally? Because there's a lot of fucking money in playing video games. And I'm not saying they should do that, but I'm saying there's a disdain for even becoming a stand-up comedian. Like I remember when I was thinking about being a comedian, no one encouraged me. Like maybe a couple of my friends, but outside of that, like my parents didn't encourage me. No one thought it was a good idea. They were like, "What are the odds you're going to make it?" Like this is the perspective. Because there's no real structure in terms of someone showing you and teaching you, and it's not a class you can take where you can graduate, and then eventually you go on to, you know, apprentice as, you know, with a more successful comedian. There's so many different things that a person could do creatively with their life in terms of art, music, whatever you want to do. There's a lot of different avenues for life that people are thriving in. But schools never encourage these things. And they look at these kids that are they're class clowns or the loudmouths or the ones that don't want to pay attention, and they just assume that kid's fucked. And that's what I assumed about my own self. I would see that and I would go, well, obviously I'm not that intelligent and I'm not that curious. But that wasn't what the case was. It was just I wasn't interested in what they were selling.
Right.
The way they were teaching it was not interesting to me. I didn't like the teachers particularly. There's so many of them that were undermotivated. They didn't enjoy it.
Yeah.
They weren't particularly good at persuading you to be enthusiastic about these subjects that they were teaching.
Did you have any teachers, though, that were good? That you
Yeah,
did?
I had a few. I had a
Yeah.
Spanish teacher that was great. He was a lot of fun. He made Spanish interesting.
Yeah.
I had an English teacher that was really fun, and she gave you perspectives and thoughts on life itself that was just different than the way most, and everybody would talk about her. Like, you got to get, I forget her name. I think it was Mrs. Hanson. But everybody wanted to get her class because she was interesting.
Yeah.
And she wasn't even that interesting, you know, but she was interesting enough.
Right.
And she was kind and she was friendly and she wasn't, you know, this authoritarian. And she gave you this idea that class could be something other than this monotonous grind, this fucking sand sandwich that everybody else was serving.
Yeah.
It was just so dry and boring.
Oh, yeah. Well, I remember my 8th grade geometry class was so boring. It was just, you know, the proofs and, you know, all of that. And it was only, you know, years later that I found out how really interesting geometry could be, especially when I started building. And I go, wow, this is interesting. And then, of course, I just got into geometry just as a area of interest itself. And that's when I discovered things like sacred geometry and, you know, when we talk about the pyramids and things like that, you know, and how geometry was used through the ages. And it was just unbelievably fascinating. And at some point, it'd be fun to have a discussion just about that.
Yeah, I would love to do that.
Yeah, that would be...
next time we'll just lay off the catastrophic events and only talk about geometry. Yeah.
Well, we have to maybe tie it in a little bit.
A little bit.
A little
bit. A little bit.
Because actually there is some connections there.
So we've already done 3 hours. You want to wrap this up?
We should probably wrap it up.
Okay.
I mean, I'm headed back to Atlanta Tuesday morning.
All right.
So Sunday, we've got this reservation to Ranger's going to guide us to Canyon Lake Gorge. We've got some extra spaces. I don't know if you've got any opening on Sunday if you wanted to jump in for.
How far away is that?
It's about halfway to San Antonio, maybe an hour south.
Let's talk afterwards. I have a show Sunday night. I don't know if I'm going to be able to do that.
Okay. Well, we could get you back, I think.
We'll see.
We'll see. Yeah.
Let me see what I can do.
If not,
but to let people know if they want to get more into your research or read any of the stuff or watch any of those videos, particularly the videos that we were talking about earlier on Atlantis, where's the best place?
RandallCarlson.com.
Randall
Thought I'd make it easy.
That's pretty easy.
Yeah, I had to spend $500 to buy my name, but
did you?
Yeah.
Who had it? Another Randall Carlson?
Yeah, there was another Randall Carlson.
Yeah, I had to buy JoeRogan.com.
Oh, did you?
Yeah.
I finally just had to go and off the guy to. No, I didn't do that. $500 is what it cost me.
It's a good deal.
It was a good deal. Yeah.
Listen, man, I appreciate you very much. I appreciate what you do. It's always very fascinating and intriguing to talk to you, and I'm just glad you're out there.
I'm having a good life. You know, it's going good. We've had the ups and downs, as you well know. Last time I saw you, actually, I was in the audience when you were in Atlanta.
How long ago was that?
Must have been like, 3 years ago?
Probably.
Something like
Something like that. Was that the Tabernacle?
No, I don't. It wasn't. Where else did you?
Oh.
I don't remember. Only thing I remember was I was laughing my ass off.
Well, that's great.
Yeah, I actually thought that, God, he's got, I don't remember what it was, but you had me going.
Good.
Yeah.
Beautiful. That's the goal.
That's the goal, yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Randall, and we'll do this again.
Oh, absolutely.
All right.
Because I got a lot more to show you,
All
man.
right. Well, it'll happen another time.
Yeah,
All
good
right.
deal.
Thanks, brother.
You're welcome,
All right. Bye,
Joe.
everybody.